The first image David Fincher gives you is the back of a woman's head. Amy Dunne, though you don't know her name yet, sits at a window in a yellow glow, and the camera creeps toward the blonde curtain of her hair with the slow, deliberate patience of something predatory. Nick Dunn's voice comes in over the top. What are you thinking? How are you feeling? What have we done to each other? What will we do? It's a gorgeous question, and it's soaked in dread. Those 11 words might be the most efficient piece of scene setting in any thriller of the 2010s. They don't announce the genre, they don't warn you, they ask quietly, almost tenderly, whether a marriage is always a kind of war fought in private, whether the person sleeping beside you is ever truly known, whether love is just the world's most elaborate performance. And then the title slams onto a black screen, and Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross start doing something deeply unsettling to a keyboard, and you are in. Gone Girl made 370.9 million at a global box office against a 61 million budget, and no amount of financial analysis will explain what actually happened. What happened is that David Fincher made a film that lodged itself in the cultural spine of an entire decade and never fully came out. People watched it twice in the same weekend. Film professors assigned it alongside Hitchcock. Twitter. This was peak. Twitter fractured into warring camps about whether Amy Dunne was a feminist icon or the most dangerous misogynist caricature Hollywood had produced in years. That debate, by the way, still hasn't been resolved. It probably shouldn't be. What I want to do in this video is go deep, not just the plot mechanics, not just the cool girl speech, although we will absolutely get to that, but the full thing, the book to film architecture, the way Fincher and Flynn rethought what a thriller could look like in the age of cable news hysteria, the way Trent Reznor built a score that sounds like a lullaby composed by someone who hates you, the way Rosamund Pike delivered a performance so controlled, so specifically calibrated that it earned her an Academy Award nomination and made every room she entered feel like the inside of a trap. The way Ben Affleck weaponized his own public image to do something quietly brilliant that nobody gave him enough credit for at the time. This is Gone Girl. All of it. Let's go. Why this movie? Why now? Here's something worth saying up front. Gone Girl gets more interesting with time, not less. When it came out in October 2004, it was reviewed primarily as a thriller, a sleek, nasty piece of studio craft from one of Hollywood's most technically gifted directors. And fair enough, because it works as that, completely. But 10 years on, the film reads as something closer to prophecy. We live now in a world where criminal cases are tried on social media before they reach a courtroom, where a missing white woman generates a news cycle the size of a natural disaster and then disappears from the cycle just as quickly once the ratings metrics shift, where the performance of grief, performed at a press conference with the right tie and the right tremor in the voice, is arguably more important to a legal outcome than physical evidence. Gone Girl understood all of this in 2014 and built it into the architecture of its story so seamlessly that you might miss it if you're too busy watching the plot. Nick Dunne's situation, husband of a missing woman, immediately cast as suspicious by a media hungry for a villain, was not invented from whole cloth. Scott Peterson, Casey Anthony, John Bennett Ramsey, the history of American true crime is full of cases where the public verdict arrived weeks before the legal one, shaped by cable news pundits who had no access to evidence and no accountability for being wrong. Missy Pyle's Ellen Abbott, the screeching cable host who declares Nick guilty with the confidence of someone reading from a prepared script, is a note-perfect parody of Nancy Grace, and the film doesn't need to name her because the archetype is so immediately recognizable that naming her would actually dilute the point. That's what Fincher and Flynn are doing at every level here. They're not just making a thriller. They're conducting a formal examination of the media ecosystem that surrounds crime, the way marriage gets performed for the outside world, and, most uncomfortably, the way we construct narratives about people we love and then mistake those narratives for the people themselves. Hot Take: Gone Girl is, at its core, a film about storytelling, about who gets to tell the story, when they get to tell it, and what version of reality that story creates. Amy's diary is a story. Nick's press conference is a story. The Amazing Amy books that Amy's parents wrote throughout her childhood, warping her real experiences into a more palatable, more perfect fictional version. Those are stories too, and they're the original wound the entire film builds outward from. Everything that happens, every manipulation, every pivot, every carefully orchestrated performance is someone trying to control the narrative. The most powerful person in the film isn't the one with the most physical leverage. It's the one who controls what everyone else believes. The Fincher effect. Before we get into the film itself, we need to talk about what David Fincher brings to a project like this, because it's not a neutral presence. Fincher is one of a small group of American directors. Kubrick is the patron saint of the lineage, who are so obsessed with precision that the precision itself becomes the subject. A Fincher film is controlled in a way that becomes about control. The camera doesn't wander, it doesn't stumble onto things accidentally. It arrives exactly where Fincher decided it would arrive, often after 50 takes. And yes, that number is documented, not exaggerated. Producer Cian Chaffin confirmed that Fincher averaged roughly 50 takes per scene on Gone Girl. That kind of directorial neuroticism either infuriates your actors or forces something extraordinary out of them. With Rosamund Pike, it produced something extraordinary. Fincher had already made Seven, Fight Club, Zodiac, and The Social Network by the time he arrived at Gone Girl. Each of those films deals, in different ways, with the same underlying obsession: how fragile the social order is, how easily it can be manipulated by a single determined person who understands its rules better than everyone else around them. Fight Club is Tyler Durden understanding consumer culture's rules. The Social Network is Mark Zuckerberg understanding Silicon Valley's rules. Zodiac is a killer who understands the rules of evidence and geography well enough to operate in the gaps. Gone Girl is Amy Dunne, understanding the rules of marriage, media, and gender performance, and then exploiting every single one of them. This is Fincher's natural habitat. He didn't just adapt this book, he lived in it. What's particularly striking about Gone Girl in the context of his career is how it deploys his characteristic visual coldness in service of something explicitly domestic. This isn't a murder in a grimy urban precinct or a conspiracy mapped across a corkboard. It's a house in Missouri, a marriage, a kitchen floor. The mise en scene of the film is deliberately mundane. Beige carpets, IKEA, adjacent furniture, the aesthetics of the American middle class, and Fincher shoots it with the same clinical remove he'd apply to a crime scene in a thriller about serial killers. Which is the point, right? He's asking us to look at the domestic space like it is a crime scene. The cinematography is by Jeff Cronenweth, Fincher's long-term collaborator, whose eye for the way light creates unease in familiar spaces is some of the finest work in contemporary American film. We'll dig into the visual grammar of Gone Girl in detail later in this video, but for now, just file this away. Every frame in this movie is making an argument. The light is not neutral. The framing is not accidental. When Amy speaks directly to camera in her cool girl voiceover, that cold fluorescent bathroom light draining her features into something mask-like and remote, that's not just aesthetically striking. It's Cronenweth and Fincher telling you exactly what kind of person you're looking at. A surface, a reflection, a performance. The book Gone Girl began as a novel by Gillian Flynn, published in June 2002. It became one of the defining commercial and cultural phenomena of the decade, one of those books that people pressed into the hands of friends with the energy of a warning. Flynn, a former weekly entertainment journalist, had published two previous novels, Sharp Objects and Dark Places, that established her as a writer of dark psychological fiction, but neither had prepared the reading public for what Gone Girl was. The novel works in alternating perspectives, Nick's first-person present tense narration and Amy's diary entries, and the central structural trick, the one the film carefully preserves and adapts, is that both narrators are unreliable. Nick is omitting things. Amy is inventing things. The reader has to triangulate reality from two sources that are both actively manipulating them, which means Flynn is essentially asking her readers to become detectives, parsing each chapter for what's present, what's absent, and what's being performed. It's a deeply sophisticated structure, and it creates a problem for film adaptation that Fincher and Flynn solve in a particular way. You can't maintain a mystery about the nature of a novel's unreliable narrator when you can see the character's face. Rosamund Pike's face is too expressive, too present, too there for the same slow burn revelation of the novel to function identically on screen. So they adjusted. The film reveals Amy's scheme to the audience before it reveals it to Nick. We see Amy alive in the Ozarks campground while Nick is still frantically searching, and this shift from mystery to dramatic irony changes the entire texture of the thriller. Instead of asking what happened to Amy, the film starts asking how does this end? That transition happens roughly at the film's midpoint, and we map it precisely when we reach the story analysis sections of this video. Flynn adapted her own novel for the screen, which almost never happens. Typically, studios hand a first draft adaptation over to an experienced screenwriter and the original author exits the process. That Fincher kept Flynn in the room for the entire process, revising scenes dozens of times, is a testament to both her adaptability and his recognition that the novel's voice, that specific acidic interior quality, was the thing worth protecting. What you feel when you watch Gone Girl, that sensation of being lied to pleasurably and deliberately, isn't accidental. It's the result of the person who understood these characters most deeply fighting to keep their DNA intact on screen. A film that asked hard questions. Here's what made Gone Girl genuinely divisive rather than just generically controversial. The film, and the novel it's based on, was embraced by a significant portion of feminist critics and readers as a sharp, cathartic critique of the expectations placed on women in marriage and media culture. Amy's cool girl speech, her articulation of how women perform effortless perfection for men who'll never appreciate the performance, resonated with millions of women who recognized that dynamic immediately. Flynn wrote that monologue as an act of radical honesty, and it landed. But the film was also accused by a different but equally thoughtful group of critics of trafficking in exactly the misogynist tropes it appeared to critique. The lying woman, the false rape accusation, the calculating manipulator underneath the perfect exterior. Those critics aren't wrong either. The film holds both of these readings simultaneously with what I'd argue is deliberate and brilliant tension, and it refuses to resolve them. That unresolved tension is why we are still talking about it. Films that comfort you with clean answers fade. Films that install an argument in your head and leave you to work it out, those stick around. Gone Girl stuck around. It's 64 on the New York Times 2025 list of the 100 best films of the 21st century. That's not a fluke. That's a film that keeps generating meaning the longer the culture sits with it. Alright, we've got 11 parts ahead of us. Let's go make sense of this thing. Production, Genesis. How Gone Girl got made. The story of how Gone Girl moved from Gillian Flynn's laptop to a David Fincher set in Cape Girardeau, Missouri is, in itself, a masterclass in how the modern Hollywood system occasionally works exactly the way it's supposed to. Flynn finished the manuscript for Gone Girl in early 2012, after roughly a year of writing. She'd been laid off from Entertainment Weekly in 2008 during the magazine industry's slow-motion collapse, and rather than treating the job loss as a disaster, she treated it as an invitation. Her first two novels, Sharp Objects 2006 and Dark Places 2009, were critically well regarded but commercially modest. Gone Girl was a different animal from the first pages. Flynn knew it. Her publishers at Crown knew it, and the entertainment industry sensed it before the book was even officially on shelves. The film rights sold to Reese Witherspoon's production company, Pacific Standard, before the book's June 2002 publication. Witherspoon had co-founded Pacific Standard specifically to develop films centered on complex women. She'd do the same thing with Wild and Big Little Lies, and she recognized in Gone Girl a project with rare dual energy, a commercial thriller with genuine literary architecture underneath it. The deal moved fast. Witherspoon would produce alongside her partner Bruno Papandrea, and Flynn would write the screenplay herself. That last part was unusual enough to be worth dwelling on. Most novelists don't adapt their own work well. The problem is one of distance. You need to be able to murder your darlings, and the person most attached to every subplot, every interiority, every carefully placed bit of interior monologue is inevitably the person who spent years writing them. Flynn, however, had two things going for her that most novelist adapters don't. First, she'd spent years as a journalist writing in the tight, functional language of deadline work. She understood economy in prose. Second, and more importantly, she grasped instinctively that a screenplay and a novel are different technologies for delivering the same story. The novel's power comes from being inside two unreliable heads simultaneously. The screenplay had to find a different gear, and Flynn found it. Externalize the interiority, let the performance carry what the prose narrated, and trust David Fincher to fill the space between words with visual information. Fincher enters. David Fincher was attached to direct while the script was still being developed, and his involvement changed the project's center of gravity immediately. Fincher had been in conversations with 20th Century Fox, the project's studio home, about Gone Girl from relatively early in its development. His relationship with Fox was long and occasionally tense. He'd made Fight Club there in 1999, a film that bombed theatrically and was then redeemed so comprehensively by DVD sales and cultural canonization that the studio effectively owed him a lifetime of goodwill. Gone Girl was the right kind of project for their partnership, a guaranteed bestseller adaptation, built-in audience awareness, adult skewing material that wouldn't require the kind of special effects budget that makes studios sweat. What Fincher brought immediately, beyond his camera sense and his obsessive precision, was the understanding that Gone Girl needed to be genuinely funny, not comedy funny. Darkly, uncomfortably funny. The kind of funny that makes you laugh and then feel terrible about laughing. Flynn's novel had this quality in spades, particularly in Nick's chapters, where his hapless obliviousness to the depth of the trap closing around him has an almost Shakespearean comic quality. Fincher and Flynn agreed early that leaning into this tonal register, the dry, pitch-black humor of a marriage that's become a war, would elevate the film above the standard thriller template. There are moments in Gone Girl that are genuinely, specifically hilarious. Nick's sister Margot, played by Carrie Coon in the performance of her early career, has a verbal dryness in her responses to Nick's escalating disaster that functions like a Greek chorus with better one-liners. Tanner Bolt, Tyler Perry's shark defense attorney, arrives into the story like a figure from a different, glossier film and brings that incongruity with him as a comic engine. Even Kim Dickens's detective Bonnie has a wry knowingness in her early scenes with Nick that shades her from investigating detective to woman who's watching a man desperately pretend to be normal and finding it very, very interesting. The humor doesn't undercut the thriller, it sharpens it because it keeps the audience off balance in a way that pure dread alone never could. Casting Amy Dunne. The casting of Amy Dunne is one of the great stories in recent Hollywood history, and it deserves to be told carefully. Fincher and his casting team considered a significant number of A-list actresses for the role. The names that circulated publicly included Charlize Theron, Emily Blunt, and Natalie Portman, all of whom would have been commercially logical choices, all of whom have the range to handle the role's demands. The role required an actress who could perform warmth convincingly enough to make you believe Nick fell in love with her, perform distress convincingly enough to make you believe she's a victim, and then, in a second act pivot that asks everything of the performer, reveal the calculation underneath both without collapsing the entire edifice of the character. It's one of the technically hardest things a screen actress can be asked to do, because you're essentially playing three different women who are all the same woman. Rosamund Pike was, by 2013, a well-regarded British actress who'd been excellent in smaller roles, the icy Miranda Frost in D, Another Day, a notable supporting performance in Pride and Prejudice, but had never carried a major American studio production as the lead. She was not the obvious choice. She was the right choice. Pike screen tested multiple times for Fincher, who put her through the full battery of his process. Long takes, repeated variations, the slow grinding method that reveals whether an actor has genuine depth or is running on surface technique. What he saw was extraordinary control. Pike could hold stillness in a way that reads on camera as absolute. She could modulate the warmth in her smile with surgeon's precision. Turn it up, turn it down, make it reach her eyes, keep it from her eyes. She understood Amy's central trick, that performing perfect femininity is a kind of violence done to the self, and she'd built an entire internal logic for the character before she ever stood in front of Fincher's camera. The preparation she brought to the role was formidable. Pike has spoken in interviews about spending months developing Amy's physical vocabulary. The precise way she walks, the way she holds her body differently when performing Amazing Amy versus when she's alone, the way her hands behave when she's lying, relaxed, demonstrably relaxed, because a character this controlled never lets nerves reach her extremities. This isn't decoration. On a Fincher set, where the 50-take rule means every performance choice will be examined from every angle dozens of times, surface level preparation evaporates. Pike's choices were architectural, not decorative, and they held. Her Academy Award nomination for Best Actress was deserved, and, honestly, slightly undersells the achievement. The role required technical virtuosity, but it also required courage. The courage to make Amy genuinely frightening without making her a cartoon, to make her sympathetic without excusing her, to make her brilliant without making her likable. That's a needle that doesn't get threaded very often. Casting Nick Dunne Ben Affleck as Nick Dunne is a piece of casting that operates on two levels simultaneously, and Fincher knew exactly what he was doing with both of them. On the surface level, Affleck has the physicality and the charisma for Nick. He's a big man, handsome in an approachable way, with the kind of easy charm that makes you default to liking him. Nick Dunne needs to be the kind of man that a woman like Amy Dunne, brilliant, ambitious, intensely calibrated, could plausibly fall in love with. He needs to look like a certain kind of successful American masculinity. Affleck delivers that without effort. But the second level is where it gets interesting. Ben Affleck, by 2013, carried years of tabloid baggage with him everywhere he went. His marriage to Jennifer Lopez, its very public disintegration, the paparazzi coverage, the giggly era, all of it had shaped a public perception of Affleck as a man who was somehow never quite what he appeared to be, not villainous but slightly disappointing. A man whose public self and private self seemed to be in some kind of ongoing, unresolved tension. Fincher didn't just cast Ben Affleck, he cast Ben Affleck and his public image, and he used the friction between the two as a formal element of the film. When Nick stands at a press conference and smiles that smile, that famous catastrophic smile, the one that haunts the film's promotional material, it reads as inappropriate because it is inappropriate. But it also reads as the specific, recognizable smile of a famous man who's been photographed enough to have developed a reflexive, socially defensive grin that fires at awkward moments whether he wants it to or not. Every audience member who watched Gone Girl in 2014 had seen versions of that smile on red carpets and in tabloids. Fincher was reflecting something real about celebrity, adjacent masculinity back at the audience, using the star's actual history as a prop. Affleck has said in interviews that Fincher was explicit about this dynamic and asked him to lean into it rather than fight it, to let his public image do some of the narrative work. That kind of directorial trust, asking an actor to weaponize the very things that have made the press cynical about them, is either an act of brilliance or a considerable gamble. In this case, it was both, and it paid off. The supporting architecture. Every great film needs characters who do work that the leads can't do alone, and Gone Girl's supporting cast is exceptional at this. Carrie Coon as Margot, Nick's twin sister, is the film's emotional anchor. She is the character who feels things the way the film's cold, glass-smooth visual glamour doesn't. She is messy and warm and genuinely hurt by Nick's lies in a way that makes you feel the human cost of the whole situation in your chest rather than just in your head. Margot is the person the audience identifies with most naturally. The person watching the same disaster unfold that we are watching, reacting with the same mix of exasperation and love. Kuhn plays her with an unself-conscious naturalness that's especially impressive in a film where nearly everyone else is performing some version of a performance. When Margot sits across from Nick and the camera catches her face in the middle distance, unposed, processing, that's the film's humanity concentrated in one face. Tyler Perry's Tanner Bolt deserves a special paragraph because Perry is so specifically right for the role that it reads almost like commentary on Tyler Perry's entire career. Tanner Bolt is a man who makes his living performing competence, performing confidence, performing the theatrical version of legal strategy that a guilty client needs to see, and Tyler Perry has spent a career performing versions of himself at the intersection of entertainment, business, and cultural expectation. There's a meta layer to watching Perry play this particular character that the film quietly rewards. And he's funny, genuinely, perfectly funny. The scene where Bolt and Nick first meet, where Bolt demolishes Nick's alibi and defenses one by one with the cheerful efficiency of a man assembling flat-pack furniture, is one of the film's best comic scenes, and Tyler Perry plays it impeccably. Neil Patrick Harris as Desi Collings, Amy's wealthy ex-boyfriend, was another counterintuitive choice that pays dividends. Harris had spent years as Barney Stinson on How I Met Your Mother, a womanizer, a performance artist of pickup culture, and like Affleck, he brought cultural freight that Fincher could use. Desi is a man who loves Amy in the way that someone can love a person they've completely objectified, obsessively, possessively, with the conviction that what he feels constitutes the real thing. Harris plays this with a studied pleasantness that barely contains the control freak underneath, and the film lets you feel genuinely unsure for a while whether Daisy is a threat to Amy or just deeply, sadly devoted to someone who doesn't exist. Filming in the Real Missouri, one of Fincher's early decisions, and one that cost the production more than a purely practical calculus might have justified, was to shoot significant portions of Gone Girl on location in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, rather than entirely on studio lots in Los Angeles. This matters aesthetically, not just geographically. The Dunne marriage exists in a specific American context, the post-recession Midwest, a region that had absorbed enormous economic trauma in the years before the story takes place. Nick and Amy move from Manhattan, from the glittering, expensive, aspirational New York that Amy's wealthy upbringing represents, to North Carthage, Missouri, a fictionalized Midwestern town where Nick's mother is dying and his options have narrowed to the local bar. The class displacement, the spatial claustrophobia of a smaller city after a lifetime of the largest one, the particular light of the American interior that is neither romantic nor especially cinematic. All of this texture is real in the film in a way that it can't be when you're shooting on a Los Angeles backlot dressed to look like Missouri. Cape Girardeau gave the film its grain. The mall scenes, shot in an actual Missouri mall, with the specific, fluorescent, slightly desolate quality of American retail in mild decline, have an authenticity that you feel rather than consciously note. The Mississippi River that runs through the edges of the story is the actual Mississippi River, enormous and sluggish and indifferent in the way only major American waterways can be. Jeff Cronenweth's camera found in the Missouri landscape a visual metaphor that the script didn't have to state explicitly. This is a place where things go to be hidden, where the flatness of the terrain means there is nowhere dramatic to disappear to, and where the disappearance of someone can sit on top of the ordinary geography of daily life without the ground cracking open. The New York apartment, the version of Amy and Nick's life that exists only in the flashback diary sections, all warmth and amber and intimate dinner party light, was constructed on a Los Angeles soundstage. The contrast between those two visual worlds, the real Missouri and the built New York, is not coincidental. One is the truth of the marriage, the other is the story Amy tells about the marriage. The film's production design encodes this distinction into every room, and we'll map it in detail when we reach the craft analysis sections. Flynn on set. Gillian Flynn's presence on set throughout production was unusual and, by all accounts from interviews Fincher gave during the promotional cycle, genuinely valuable rather than just diplomatically tolerated. Flynn was not a passive presence. She revised dialogue between takes. She had strong opinions about which of Amy's lines could survive the translation from interiority to spoken word and which needed to be reimagined as action or reaction or silence. The famous "Cool Girl" monologue, one of the most quoted passages from both the novel and the film, went through multiple iterations before Flynn and Fincher landed on the version that made it to screen. In the novel, it's interior monologue, hot and immediate and furious. On screen, it needed a different container. Rosamund Pike in a cold bathroom, hair loose, the voiceover running under images of Amy performing the cool girl role it describes. Flynn adjusted the rhythm of the language to fit the images. The essay-like density of the prose got compressed without losing its argumentative spine. The collaboration also produced at least one significant divergence from the source material, the film's ending, without spoiling it for anyone who somehow hasn't seen it. And if you haven't, I envy you the experience of watching it cold. The film and the novel end in structurally similar but tonally slightly different places. Flynn has said that she and Fincher discussed multiple possible endings and agreed that the film's version needed to carry the weight of finality that the novel, as a novel, could afford to leave slightly more ambiguous. The film's final shot, a direct evolution of that opening image of the back of Amy's head, closes the loop with a precision that's almost mathematical. We'll spend significant time on that ending when we get there. It deserves it. It's July 5th, Nick Dunne's 5th wedding anniversary. He wakes up and notice how Fincher shoots this because it's doing a lot of work in a way that reads as slightly wrong before you can articulate why. The light is too grey. The house is too quiet. Ben Affleck moves through the frame with the loose, ungathered quality of a man who's been sleeping badly for a long time and has stopped noticing it. He goes downstairs. He finds the front door open, a cold iron on the ironing board, a broken coffee table, a cat sitting in the middle of it all with the magnificent indifference only cats can deploy. He calls Amy's name. Nobody answers. What's remarkable about this opening sequence is how precisely Fincher calibrates your uncertainty. Is this wrong? Or is this just a marriage that's gotten shabby and careless? A front door left open by accident? A woman who stepped out for a walk? You don't know yet. The film holds the ambiguity for exactly as long as it's useful, then lets you start to feel the dread underneath. Nick calls the police. And then? Here's the first truly brilliant touch. He goes to the bar. Not because he's guilty, but because it's where he goes when he doesn't know what else to do. Because his whole adult life in North Carthage has been organized around that bar. The bar, his mother's inheritance, the one he runs with, Margot. And in a crisis, humans return to the architecture of the familiar. Except it reads wrong to everyone who sees it. It reads guilty. Nick Dunne goes to his bar before the police arrive at his house, and every person watching the film makes a small, involuntary judgment about him in that moment. Fincher knows exactly what he's doing. He's not showing you Nick's guilt. He's showing you how guilt is read onto behavior that has completely ordinary explanations. This is the film's central game, and it starts within the first 10 minutes. Detective Boney and the observation machine. Detective Rhonda Boney, played by Kim Dickens, arrives at the Dunne house with her partner Officer Gilpin, and the film immediately establishes a dynamic that will define its procedural layer. Boney sees everything, and she never tells Nick what she sees. Dickens' performance is one of the film's quieter pleasures. She plays Boney as a woman who's been doing this long enough to have developed a kind of clinical appreciation for the varieties of human self-deception she encounters on the job. When she walks through the Dunne house, her eyes move with the specific, cataloging attention of someone who knows that the ordinary details, the position of a lamp, the lack of forced entry, the way a man holds his hands while answering questions are often more revealing than anything she'll find in a forensic report. She's not hostile to Nick in the early scenes. She's watchful. There's a difference, and Dickens plays it with a dry patience that gives Boney an unusual dignity for a procedural detective character. The early crime scene has a detail worth pausing on. Boney notes the blood on the kitchen floor, not a large amount, carefully distributed as though someone spilled something and made a partial effort to clean it up. She notes the cat. She notes the ironing board and the cold iron. She notes the smashed coffee table. And here, Fincher's camera does something quietly important. It lingers on the table in a way that suggests the violence was staged rather than spontaneous. The randomness a little too considered, a little too much like someone's idea of what a struggle looks like. Bonnie clocks this too. You can see her clock it. She doesn't say anything about it to Nick. This visual storytelling, giving the audience information that the characters are also receiving but not sharing with each other, is one of Fincher's signature moves, and it creates a specific kind of suspense, not the suspense of not knowing, the suspense of knowing things you don't know how to use yet. The press conference and the smile within days of Amy's disappearance, the media arrives in North Carthage. This is where Gone Girl makes its sharpest turn into satire, and it's worth acknowledging how boldly the film commits to this register. The town square vigil, the candlelight, the enlarged photograph of Amy, the earnest neighbors in fleece jackets, is shot with a quality that oscillates between genuine tenderness and subtle mockery. These people are real in their concern, but they're also performing concern in the way that televised grief always requires performance. The cameras are on, the format demands it, and Nick stands at the microphone in a suit that Margot picked, with a tie that is attorney approved, and someone in the crowd asks him to pose for a photo with an Amy Dunne lookalike. A young woman who's come to the vigil dressed in Amy's colors with Amy's blonde hair. And Nick smiles. That smile. It has become genuinely iconic in the 13-year history of the film's cultural life. And it's worth unpacking precisely because it's so much more complex than the media narrative that forms around it in the diegesis of the film. Nick smiles because someone is pointing a camera at him, and he has spent his entire adult life reflexively smiling at cameras. He smiles because the socially encoded response to someone arranging a photo is to smile. He smiles because his nervous system is doing something over which his conscious mind has incomplete control. He is not smiling because he is happy. He is not smiling because he killed his wife and doesn't care. He is smiling the way people laugh at funerals, the way emotions misfire catastrophically in moments of extreme stress and produce responses that are technically inappropriate but fundamentally human. But it looks guilty. God, it looks guilty. Fincher holds on that smile for precisely long enough to let you feel both things at once, the human explanation and the damning optics, and then cuts to Missy Pye's Ellen Abbott on cable television using the image as evidence of something monstrous. This is the film's thesis delivered in a single edit. The image means one thing, the broadcast of the image means something else entirely. And the thing that gets remembered, the thing that shapes public opinion and potentially legal outcomes, is the broadcast, not the reality. Margot, go! If Nick is the film's unreliable navigator, Margot is its compass. Carrie Coon's work as Margot, Nick's twin sister, his closest confidant, the person who knows him well enough to catch his lies even when she doesn't want to, is the kind of performance that holds a film together from the interior. Margot doesn't have Amy's pyrotechnics or Nick's doomed central position. She has something more durable. She feels like a real person, with a full life that exists outside the plot's mechanics, with her own frustrations and private griefs that the film registers without pausing to explain. The twin dynamic is significant. Fincher and Flynn use it to say something about the difference between the intimacy of choice and the intimacy of circumstance. Nick and Amy chose each other, performed their love in public, built a shared identity around their shared story. Nick and Margot were born into each other, grew up fighting and forgiving, and knowing the worst versions of themselves before either of them had the tools to hide it. When Margot looks at Nick in the early scenes and says, with a flatness that barely conceals how frightened she is, "I don't think you should smile anymore," it lands as the film's first moment of unguarded, non-performed human emotion. Nobody is watching Margot, no cameras, no pretense, just a woman who loves her brother and is watching the ground drop out from under both of them. Coon had not done much film work before Gone Girl. Her career was primarily in theatre and early television. Fincher reportedly pushed her hard in auditions before casting her, and what he found was someone with the technical foundation to survive 50-take shoots and the naturalistic instincts to make every line sound like the first time it had occurred to her character to say it. She is extraordinary, and the film's emotional credibility, the reason the thriller stakes feel genuinely human rather than merely mechanical, rests largely on her shoulders. The media circus takes shape. Let's stay with the media layer of the film for a moment, because it's doing something genuinely sophisticated that gets underplayed in most Gone Girl discussions. The missing white woman syndrome, the documented media phenomenon where the disappearances of white, conventionally attractive, middle class women receive disproportionate coverage compared to missing persons cases involving women of color or lower socioeconomic backgrounds, is not something the film names explicitly. It doesn't need to. The film simply enacts it with a clarity that's almost brutally straightforward. Amy Dunne is white, beautiful, wealthy, Harvard educated, the subject of a beloved children's book series. She is the platonic ideal of a cable news missing person story, and the coverage she receives is correspondingly massive. Ellen Abbott's show, unmistakably modeled on Nancy Grace's Nancy Grace on HLN, down to the aggressive prosecution before evidence style and the audience baiting outrage machine, is the film's primary satirical target, and Fincher never softens the critique. Abbott declares Nick guilty with the cheerfulness of someone who's found a great story and has no intention of letting inconvenient facts complicate it. She uses photographs, out of context quotes, and amateur hour body language analysis to build a case that has no legal standing and complete cultural power. Her audience believes her. The national sentiment tilts against Nick, and Nick, who hasn't been charged with anything, who has no meaningful recourse against a television host who's decided he's a monster, watches his life get dismantled in real time by a medium he can't fight. The film is very clear that this is not a story about an exceptional bad actor in the media ecosystem. This is the system functioning normally. Abbott isn't breaking rules. She's following incentives. The incentives reward conflict, certainty, and attractive victim narratives. Abbott is simply good at her job, where her job means maximizing those metrics regardless of what the evidence actually suggests. There is a sharp little detail in how the film handles this. The shots of people watching Ellen Abbott's show are never contemptuous of the viewers. They are not painted as gullible or stupid. They are painted as people consuming the narrative that's available to them, in the format available to them, making reasonable enough inferences from what they've been given. The critique is systemic, not personal. That's a harder and more honest argument than most films in this territory manage. Nick's hidden life. Here's where the first major crack in Nick's alibi opens. The discovery, by Detective Boney, that Nick has been having an affair. The affair is with one of his students, Andy Hardy, played by Emily Ratajkowski, a young woman significantly younger than Nick, which is exactly as bad as it sounds from an optic standpoint, and precisely as legally irrelevant as Nick's lawyer keeps having to explain to Nick himself. Nick didn't kill Amy, but Nick was cheating on Amy, which means Nick has been lying to the police from day one, which means Nick's entire posture of bewildered, cooperative husbandly concern has been a performance, which means everything the public and the police think they know about the dynamics of this marriage needs to be re-evaluated. This is the film being very deliberate about its argument. Nick's guilt is not legal guilt, but it's not innocence either. He is a man who was lying in his marriage, who brought real damage to a real relationship, who built a double life on top of his domestic one. His suffering is genuine. His threat to Amy is, as far as we know, zero. And none of that means he's a good person or that his wife's disappearance is entirely without context. The film refuses to let the audience off the hook of holding both of these truths simultaneously. You can feel bad for Nick's situation and also think he's a deeply flawed man. You can believe he didn't harm Amy and also understand why Boney keeps looking at him sideways. The affair, when it's fully revealed, is also one of the film's darker jokes. Amy knew about it. Of course she did. Amy knows everything about Nick, has been cataloging his flaws and failures with the meticulous attention of a researcher building a case, because that's exactly what she's been doing. The affair doesn't merely complicate the investigation. In Amy's hands, it becomes a weapon, another layer of the frame she's constructing around her absent, terrified husband. The treasure hunt. Every year on their anniversary, Amy creates an elaborate treasure hunt for Nick. Clues leading to clues, each one revealing something about their relationship history, ending at a gift. In the context of a missing person investigation, this annual ritual becomes something that makes the detective's eyes go very still when Nick mentions it. It is, on its face, charming. The kind of elaborate, loving gesture that people point to when describing a marriage that worked, a partnership built on playful intimacy and shared history. And it is those things. It was, at some point in the Dunne marriage, a genuine expression of Amy's investment in their relationship. But Amy has left this year's treasure hunt running. The clues are still out there, waiting. And Nick, under the pressure of a police investigation and the suspicion of an entire nation, is going to have to follow them, because if there's any chance Amy left information about what happened to her hidden in the treasure hunt's logic, ignoring them would be insane. But following them looks, to every camera and every reporter, like a man who is suspiciously calm about his wife's disappearance, suspiciously organized, suspiciously focused. This is Amy's genius, and it's also the film's clearest early statement of its thematic argument. The treasure hunt was, in the past, an act of love. Now it's a trap. The material of the marriage, its rituals, its private language, its specifically intimate gestures, has been repurposed as ammunition. Everything that made the relationship meaningful has been weaponized. Fincher shoots the treasure hunt sequences with a particular light, warm, amber, slightly soft focus that's at odds with the cold procedural grace of the investigation scenes. This is deliberate and precise. Every time the film drops into the treasure hunt, it's dropping into Amy's version of the past, her curated, constructed, already revised account of what their marriage was. The beauty of those frames is not neutral, it's manipulative. You're being asked to feel nostalgia for something that may never have existed in exactly the form it's being shown to you. The first clue leads to Nick's office, the second to a neighbor's woodshed. Each location, as Bonnie notes without saying anything directly to Nick, connects to spaces associated with Nick's movements, Nick's routines, Nick's secret geography. As though Amy had been mapping her husband with the thoroughness of someone who expected to need the map later. She had been the diary. Amy's voice enters. Running parallel to Nick's present-day crisis is Amy's diary, which the police find and read, and which the film delivers to us in voiceover as Rosamund Pike reads entries that span from Amy and Nick's first meeting through their courtship, early marriage, the move to Missouri, and the growing, documented terror that Nick is going to kill her. The diary is a masterpiece of constructed voice. Amy writes with the luminous, self-aware intelligence of a woman who has spent a lifetime performing herself for an audience. Amazing. Amy, the fictional, idealized version of her that her parents published in a children's book series throughout her childhood, has given the real Amy an unusual relationship with self-presentation. She knows what performing a self looks like from the inside. Her diary entries have the quality of someone who understands that diaries are not just private documents. They are the most intimate possible performance. A performance for the future self who will read them back. And she already knows, even as she's writing, possibly for an audience she's not naming yet. The entries about Nick's courtship are gorgeous and devastating in equal measure. The giddiness of new love rendered in a specific, sharp prose style. Amy is not a foggy romantic. She notices details. The particular way Nick laughs, the quality of his attention, gives you genuine feeling for what this relationship was at its best. You understand why she loved him. This is crucial, and it's something lesser films would skip. You need to understand what was real in the marriage for the loss of it to carry actual weight. Then the entries shift. Gradually, by increments too small to identify at any single moment, the warmth in the diary cools. Nick gets less attentive. The move to Missouri, which Amy didn't want, which she agreed to under a form of emotional pressure she records without quite naming it, robs her of the life she'd built, the friends, the career, the city that was her native habitat. She describes becoming someone smaller, someone whose choices are being made by the logic of her husband's needs. She describes fear, eventually, a cracked mirror, a push on a staircase. A husband who is losing his warmth and gaining an edge that she doesn't recognize. Every entry is a lie. That's the punchline, and it's the film's boldest structural gambit. What you're reading, what the police are reading, what the film is presenting to us as the most intimate possible document, the private diary, is fabricated. Amy wrote all of it in the weeks before her disappearance. The fear is performed. The love story is curated to create a specific impression. The relationship she describes is real in its broad architecture and invented in its specific dramatic moments. And yet, you fell for it. I fell for it. The first time you watch Gone Girl, the diary sequences feel like the film giving you the truth underneath Nick's version, the feminine subjectivity behind the masculine public story. The film is exploiting your own narrative expectations, your trained assumption that the diary is where the real person lives. Flynn understood this and built the entire second act revelation around it. We'll get to that revelation in part 5. But for now, I just want you to sit with the specific feeling of realizing, retrospectively, that you were reading a performance the whole time and thought you were reading a soul. Before we move the plot forward, let's stay in the structure for a moment, because Gone Girl's formal construction is genuinely unusual for a mainstream Hollywood thriller, and understanding it is what separates a surface level appreciation of the film from a real one. The film operates in two distinct temporal registers simultaneously. There's Nick's present tense story, the investigation, the media circus, the slowly tightening noose of public opinion, the affair coming to light. And there's Amy's past tense story, the diary, the courtship, the marriage's gradual deterioration, the escalating fear. These two timelines don't merely run in parallel, they argue with each other. Every time the film cuts from Nick's present to Amy's past, it's asking you to hold both versions of the marriage in your head at once and feel the friction between them. This is fundamentally a literary technique, not a cinematic one. Gillian Flynn built the novel's architecture around exactly this friction, the reader navigating two unreliable voices toward a truth that neither of them will give you directly. The challenge for the film adaptation was how to achieve this effect visually, without the novel's capacity to render interior monologue directly. Fincher and Flynn's solution is elegant. They use light and texture as the structural equivalent of point of view. Nick's present tense scenes are shot in the cool, desaturated palette of contemporary Missouri. Grey skies, fluorescent institutional lighting, the specific drabness of municipal spaces, police stations, press conference rooms, the mall where he meets Andy. The color temperature hovers around something that feels like a headache coming on. There's no romance in it. There's no comfort. It's the visual glamour of a man whose life has been stripped of warmth. Amy's diary sequences, by contrast, are saturated in amber and gold. The New York apartment glows with the soft, directional light of a Vermeer painting, warm window light, intimate interiors, the specific honeyed quality of late afternoon in a room where someone is happy. Fincher and Cronenberg built this contrast so carefully that you can tell, before a single word of voiceover begins, which timeline you're in. The light itself is narrating. And then, here's the masterstroke. As the diary entries move forward in time, as the marriage cools and the fear sets in, the warm palette gradually drains. The Missouri sections get slightly warmer as we come to know them. The diary sections get cooler. The two color worlds begin to converge. It's a visual representation of the film's central thesis. The past and the present are both constructions, both performances, and the truth, if it exists at all, lives somewhere in the cold gap between them. Amazing Amy and the original performance. The backstory of Amazing Amy. Amy's parents, Rand and Marybeth Elliott, played by David Clennon and Lisa Baines, who wrote a series of beloved children's books based on their daughter's life, is the film's origin myth, and it's handled with an economy that's almost surgical. The conceit is almost too cruel to be believed. Amy's parents observed her actual childhood and then published a slightly improved, slightly more perfect version of it in a book series that became beloved by an entire generation of children. Real Amy failed a gymnastics test. Amazing Amy passed it. Real Amy lost a best friend. Amazing Amy made a new, better one. Real Amy's real life, with its real disappointments and real failures and real messy humanness, was systematically revised into something palatable, something that sold, something that parents could use as a benchmark for their own children. Growing up as the source material for a fictional version of yourself that is measurably more successful than you. That is a specific kind of psychological horror that the film doesn't overstate or melodramatize. It simply plants the fact and trusts the audience to feel its weight. Amy Elliott grew up knowing that there was an approved public version of her that required maintenance. She grew up understanding that who she actually was and who she was supposed to be were two different projects, and that the public version was the one that generated love and attention and the approving smiles of parents who were also, in a meaningful sense, her publishers. She became exceptional at performance because performance was the family business. This background is essential to understanding Amy's psychology, not as an excuse, but as an explanation for the architecture. When Amy constructs the amazing Amy version of her marriage in the diary, she's doing something she's been trained for since childhood. She is her own author. She knows exactly how the heroine of this story should behave, what details to include, what register to write in, how to calibrate the reader's sympathy. The diary isn't just a frame up, it's a lifetime of skill applied to a specific problem. Rand and Meribeth, when they appear in the investigation scenes, are fascinating supporting figures. They're genuinely distraught about Amy's disappearance. Their grief reads as real, and simultaneously, their presence in the media, their willingness to go on television, their fluency with the public performance of parental anguish reflects something about how they raised their daughter. This is a family that has always known how to work a room. The tragedy is that they don't know, can't know, that their daughter has become better at it than they ever were. The weight of the clue in the woodshed. Let's return to the treasure hunt, specifically to the moment in it that the film uses to complicate Nick's position most decisively in the first act. One of the clues leads Nick to the woodshed behind the property, a neighbor's storage space that Nick knows from having spent time there. And when he opens the door and follows the clue, he finds, tucked behind a stack of old lumber, a collection of purchases. High-end items, items beyond the declared budget of the Dunne household. Items that Nick knows he didn't buy. He closes the woodshed. He doesn't tell Bonnie. This decision, straightforwardly, legally, catastrophically stupid, is also completely human, and Affleck plays the moment of realization with a specific quality that's worth describing. It's not fear, exactly. It's the particular cognitive freeze of a man who has just seen something that he doesn't yet understand, but whose implications are large enough to stop him breathing. He has no idea what the objects in the woodshed mean. He only knows that if he reports them to the police, the explanation he'd have to give, "I didn't know they were here, I have no idea where they came from," is the most obviously guilty sounding thing a man in his position could possibly say. So he closes the door. This is the film's first fully realized illustration of its central mechanical insight, that innocence, in the context of constructed guilt, often looks exactly like guilt. Nick's silence is the silence of a frightened, confused, non-guilty man who doesn't know how to explain what he's found. But it's also exactly what a guilty man would do. The film understands that the difference between innocent and scared and guilty and calculating can be, from the outside, completely invisible. Detective Bonnie understands this too, which is why she keeps watching. Tanner Bolt arrives. The film shifts gears with the arrival of Tanner Bolt, and Tyler Perry announces his presence with an energy that the film's first act has been deliberately withholding. Perry enters a story that has been, up to this point, constructed from dread and grey procedural light, and he brings with him something that functions almost like a key change in music: the assurance, the comfort, the specific breezy confidence of a man who has seen things much worse than your situation and won anyway. Tanner Bolt is introduced as the attorney celebrities hire when they're guilty, which is how everyone in the media describes him, and which is precisely the framing that makes him useful to Nick. He doesn't deal in innocence, he deals in outcomes. The scene where Bolt first interrogates Nick, not defends, interrogates, which is significant, is one of Ben Affleck's best in the film. Bolt moves through Nick's story with the systematic efficiency of a man looking for every weak point before an opponent finds them, and Affleck has to play Nick receiving this process. The dawning, nauseating realization of just how many weak points there are, how many weak points there are, how many ways in which his ordinary, flawed human life can be read as the behavior of a killer. The affair, the life insurance policy, the financial troubles. The gap between the marriage he described to police and the marriage the diary describes. Perry plays Bolt with such a specific, pleasurable self-possession that every scene he's in has a different texture from the scenes around it. He doesn't perform concern, he performs mastery. And in a film full of people performing things they're not sure they believe, a character who's found a genuine comfort in his own competence is almost relaxing to watch. Not trustworthy, exactly. Bolt is very clear that he's a hired gun, that his investment is in strategy rather than truth, but reliable, which in the world of Gone Girl is its own kind of rarity. The practical information Bolt delivers. The life insurance policy Nick didn't know Amy had taken out on herself. The forensic evidence being developed, the precise shape of the case the prosecution would make, functions as the film's operational briefing. It gathers the scattered threads of the first act and shows them to you as a unified design. And as Bolt lays it out, the genius of what Amy has done begins to come fully into focus. Every element is mundane in isolation, plausibly accidental, but arranged correctly, they form a pattern that is almost impossible to explain away. That's not coincidence. That's architecture. What Nick is not saying, there's a tension the film maintains across its entire first act that deserves explicit attention because it's the primary engine of the thriller's mechanics. The distinction between what Nick is not saying to the police and the audience and what Nick is not saying because he did something versus what Nick is not saying because he's embarrassed, frightened, and bad at communicating under pressure. Ben Affleck's casting, as I discussed in the production section, means that the audience arrives at the film with a preloaded ambivalence about him specifically. But beyond that biographical dimension, Fincher and Affleck made a consistent, deliberate choice throughout the first act. Nick Dunne will never be obviously innocent. He will never do the thing that reads as guileless and open and transparently victimized. When people in obvious distress go on television, they tend to fall into a recognizable mode of communication, raw, slightly disorganized, emotionally unguarded. Nick is never that. He is controlled in a way that reads as practiced, careful in a way that reads as rehearsed, and the film asks you to decide whether that's because he's hiding guilt or because he's a man who doesn't know how to feel things in public. The answer, of course, is both and neither, which is itself the film's argument about how the optics of behavior under surveillance distorts our ability to read character. Nick is performing innocence rather than simply being innocent, and the performance is imperfect, and the imperfections get weaponized by everyone watching. He is terrible at being a public victim. This doesn't make him a villain. It makes him a person who wasn't built for the specific, strange, media-saturated ordeal he's been placed inside. There's a scene, brief, quiet, easy to miss, where Nick sits alone in the house while the search party organizes in the front yard, and his face, when he's not aware of being observed, is just exhausted, not calculating, not cold. Just a tired man in a situation that has moved so far beyond him that he can't find its edges anymore. Fincher holds this shot for exactly long enough for you to feel the human being inside the suspect, then cuts back to the public machinery moving outside the window. That cut is the whole film in miniature, the private truth and the public story separated by a pane of glass. The detective's double-bind Kim Dickens detective Bonnie operates through the first act in a state of genuine professional uncertainty that the film respects rather than resolving too quickly. Bonnie is not incompetent. She is not tunnel-visioned onto Nick as a suspect simply because he is the husband and husbands are the obvious suspect. She is a smart investigator who is genuinely working the case, and the case, legitimately, factually, evidentially speaking, keeps generating information that points toward Nick, the bloodstains, the life insurance, the affair, the woodshed. Each of these things would on its own be explicable. Together, they form a pattern that any experienced detective would notice. Bonnie notices. What makes the film interesting at the procedural level is that it shows you the legitimate reasoning process by which an investigator could build suspicion around an innocent man without making that investigator stupid or corrupt. Bonnie is neither. She is a professional doing her job with the evidence she has, and the evidence she has is the evidence that Amy designed for her to have. The investigation is functioning correctly. It's the investigation that Amy planned on. There's something profoundly unsettling about this. More unsettling, in some ways, than if Bonnie were bumbling or biased or overtly corrupt. A corrupt investigator is a system failure. Bonnie represents the system working, and the system working leads toward the wrong conclusion, because the system working is exactly what Amy anticipated and built her plan around. She didn't outsmart a broken system. She outsmarted a functional one. A town watching before we leave the first act entirely. It's worth giving a moment to what the film does with the town of North Carthage as a collective entity. The neighbors, the search volunteers, the bar patrons, the mall workers who remember seeing Amy. They're background figures, but they're not blank. Fincher peoples his margins with a specific kind of Midwestern face, not a caricature. Not a stereotype, but the real texture of a mid-sized American city that didn't ask to become a national news event and is navigating that experience with a mixture of genuine concern, uneasy celebrity, and the particular human tendency to form a narrative about the people at the center of a drama that simplifies them into roles. The neighbors who show up with casseroles, the women who attend the vigil and take selfies in front of Amy's photo, the bar regulars who become overnight people with opinions on a murder case they know entirely from television. These figures do something important. They externalize the film's argument about how communities process crime. North Carthage's relationship to Amy's disappearance tracks the media's relationship to it almost exactly. In the beginning, concern, sympathy, the communal impulse towards solidarity. Then, as the cable news narrative coalesces around Nick's guilt, uncertainty, distance, the quiet withdrawal of the benefit of the doubt. Then, in a few faces, something uglier, the specific excitement of proximity to a monster, the frisson of having shaken the hand of someone who might be capable of terrible things. It's a town doing what towns do, what media does, what people do. Gone Girl doesn't accept anyone from this. Not the characters, not the town, and not the audience watching from the outside with their own set of narratives running. Part 4 closes here, with the first act fully established, Nick's life in ruins, the investigation shaping itself around Amy's design frame, the diary having done its work on us as thoroughly as it's doing its work on Bonnie. The stage is set, and somewhere in Missouri, checked into a budget motel under a false name, Amy Dunne is watching all of it on television. She's not scared, she's taking notes. Here's where Gone Girl does something that almost no mainstream thriller released by a major studio in the last 30 years has had the nerve to do. It tells you the answer at the midpoint, not as a twist. Not as a sudden, disorienting revelation designed to make you gasp and rewind. As a deliberate, almost casual structural decision, a choice to move the film out of the mystery genre entirely and into something rarer and more uncomfortable. Roughly 55 minutes into a 2.5-hour film, we follow Amy Dunne to a budget motel in the Ozarks and we watch her peel off the performance she's been maintaining since the opening frame. She buys junk food she'd never normally eat. She watches Nick's press conference on a small television bolted to the motel wall. She laughs at something he says. She's fine. She planned this. Every single thing we watched for the first hour has been exactly what she intended. The film doesn't treat this moment as a rug pull. Fincher holds it steadily, without musical punctuation or dramatic framing. The camera watches Amy watch television, and what it observes is a woman who is completely, serenely in control of a situation that everyone else believes is a catastrophe. There's a satisfaction in her face. Not gloating, not manic. Something quieter than either of those things. The deep, settled satisfaction of a very intelligent person whose plan is working precisely as designed. This is the film's great gamble, and it pays off completely. By revealing Amy's survival and agency at the midpoint, Gone Girl transforms its final 90 minutes from a whodunit into something closer to a chess match, and one in which you can see both players' pieces, which makes it more tense, not less. The Coon Girl speech. We need to talk about this monologue. We need to sit with it properly because it's the most quoted passage in the film, the most analyzed, the most argued over, and I'd argue it's also the most misunderstood, or at least the most incompletely understood. Amy Dunne, alone in the Ozarks motel, looking at herself in a bathroom mirror with the cold fluorescent light doing its work on her features, delivers the following argument directly to the camera. She describes The Cool Girl as a performance, a specific, exhausting, culturally demanded performance that millions of women undertake for the benefit of men who will never acknowledge the labor involved. The cool girl loves football and dirty jokes and doesn't care about her weight and eats cheeseburgers and thinks your weird hobby is fascinating and never gets angry, never gets needy, never has preferences that conflict with yours. She is, Amy argues, a fiction that real women construct for real men who prefer the fiction to the reality and who will quietly punish you when the fiction drops and the actual human being underneath becomes visible. The speech is genuinely electrifying, delivered by Rosamund Pike with a precision and controlled fury that stops the film in its tracks. It reads as feminist critique, it reads as a manifesto, and for a significant portion of the audience, especially women who recognized the dynamic immediately and felt the specific cathartic relief of hearing it named so clearly. It landed as exactly that. But here's the thing the film is doing that the pure catharsis reading misses. Amy is not delivering this speech from a position of liberation. She is delivering it from a position of self justification. The cool girl critique, however accurate, is being used in this moment by a woman who has just framed her husband for murder, who is in the process of destroying his life, and who will shortly do things that are genuinely monstrous. The truth of the critique does not justify the actions built on top of it. The speech is correct and it's being weaponized. The film holds both of those things at the same time and refuses to collapse them into a simpler moral verdict. This is Flynn's most daring authorial choice, and it's what makes the film divisive in a productive rather than a merely controversial way. If Amy's critique were wrong, the film would be simple misogyny. If Amy's critique were right and Amy were simply a hero acting on it, the film would be simple wish fulfillment. Instead, the critique is right and Amy is using it to commit a crime and a kind of cruelty that the film does not excuse. You have to hold both. Most audiences don't want to hold both. They want to resolve Amy into either a villain or a victim, and the film's refusal to let them is the source of a decade's worth of argument. Amy in the Ozarks, the performance drops. What does Amy Dunne look like when nobody's watching? This is the question the Ozarks section of the film is quietly asking, and the answer is both revelatory and deeply unsettling. Without an audience, Amy moves differently, looser, less precisely calibrated. She eats fast food. She reads paperback thrillers with the relaxed concentration of someone on vacation. She's figured out a plan that required months of sophisticated preparation, and she's executing it with the methodical patience of a project manager checking tasks off a list. But there's an edge of something in these sequences that's not quite ease. Watch Rosamund Pike's eyes in the motel room scenes. There's a vigilance there that never fully turns off. The habit of monitoring one's environment, the reflexive awareness of angles and exposures and who might be looking. Amy has spent so long performing that even in private, the performer's instincts remain. She's checking the exits even when there are no cameras. This is one of Pike's most sophisticated choices in the film. She could have played Amy relaxed as simply the absence of the performance, a woman exhaling into her real self. Instead, she plays it as a slightly different performance, a woman imitating what relaxation looks like, imperfectly, because she's not sure she knows what it actually feels like anymore. Whether that's conscious character choice or something more instinctive that the 50-take process drew out of her, the result is deeply unnerving. Amy without an audience isn't free, she's just operating on a smaller stage. The motel itself is perfect casting of a location. It has the grey, transient quality of places designed to be forgotten. The kind of room where the furniture has been replaced so many times that nothing matches, where the carpet pattern was chosen specifically to hide stains. It's the opposite of the warmth-flooded New York apartment of the diary flashbacks. Fincher shoots it with the same unsparing fluorescent light he uses for police stations and press conference rooms. In the visual glamour of the film, Amy has stepped out of the amber warmth of her constructed self-narrative and into the grey reality of consequences. The campground encounter, Amy's careful isolation in the Ozarks, is disrupted when two other campground residents, Greta and Jeff, played by Lola Kirke and Boyd Holbrook, attach themselves to her with the easy, incurious friendliness of people who have nothing else to do and find her interesting. This section is often rushed through in broad summaries, but is doing something important. Greta and Jeff are the film's only characters who have no relationship to media, no cable news narrative to plug Amy's story into, no framework of missing wife or wrong woman that they're consciously applying. They just meet a woman who calls herself Nancy and find her enjoyably strange company. And for a brief window, the film offers something it almost never otherwise gives: Amy Dunne being seen without being understood. The problem, because there's always a problem when you build your life on a false identity, is that Amy has no practice at being Nancy. She knows how to perform Amy Elliott Dunne in every register the situation demands. She knows how to perform Amazing Amy, the public version her parents created. She's worked out how to perform a missing woman as viewed through a diary. But performing an ordinary, unremarkable woman with no exceptional qualities and no status markers and no reason to be interesting, that's the one character type she's never developed. She's too impressive, too contained, too specifically excellent at human interaction in ways that ordinary people find faintly alarming rather than charming. Greta clocks this eventually. Not as a threat, Greta is not that sophisticated a reader of people, but as a reason to search Amy's belongings while she's sleeping and help herself to Amy's carefully hoarded cash. The theft is a disaster. It strips Amy of her financial buffer, the primary practical resource she built her disappearance plan around, and it forces the contingency plan she calls Desi. Desi Collings and the Gilded Cage. Neil Patrick Harris enters the film here, and the energy shifts in a specific, deliberate way. Desi Collings is Amy's ex-boyfriend from Wiltshire Academy, a man who has loved Amy, or loved his idea of Amy, which he has never distinguished from Amy herself, with the obsessive-possessive thoroughness of someone who built an identity around a relationship that ended 20 years ago. He has kept a shrine to her, essentially in the form of a lake house decorated with things she mentioned once that she liked. A guest room that might have been constructed from Amy's preferred aesthetic assembled into physical space. When Amy calls Desi from a payphone, using the distress she can perform as reliably as most people perform a phone greeting, the call is already a trap. Desi hears vulnerability in Amy's voice and responds with the confident, entitled warmth of a man who has always believed Amy would eventually need him. He comes. He offers the lake house. He presents this offer as rescue. It isn't. The Collings Lake House is extraordinary production design. We'll spend significant time on it in the craft section, but its visual character deserves a note here. Where the Dunne house in Missouri is comfortable middle-class beige, and where the Ozarks motel is grey and forgettable, the Collings Lake house is sleek, spare, relentlessly tasteful. It's beautiful in the way of a very expensive hotel, or a showroom, or a space designed by someone who thinks deeply about how spaces should make people feel but doesn't actually feel comfortable in them himself. The house is a performance of refinement, which makes it the perfect environment for Desi, a man performing devotion, and a perfect nightmare for Amy. Because Amy is not rescued, she is rehoused in a different cage. Desi's version of care is surveillance. The cameras on the property he installed for her safety, the gentle management of her diet and wardrobe and schedule, the way his concern functions as control without ever acknowledging itself as such. He locks the doors at night, not for her protection, for his. He is keeping her, in the most literal possible sense, and wrapping the keeping in the language of love. Amy watches all of this with her characteristic animal alertness, and she adapts. She gives Desi the performance he wants: vulnerability, gratitude, the suggestion of a woman who is beginning to rediscover what she valued in their earlier relationship. She is building the next chapter of the film. Desi, who is intelligent enough to have made a fortune, but not intelligent enough to ask why Amy came to him specifically, accepts every performance at face value because what he sees is the thing he's always wanted to see. Nick's decision, going on television, back in North Carthage. Nick Dunne makes the decision that changes the shape of the investigation. He goes on television. Tanner Bolt, predictably, advises against it. Sharon Shiba, an Oprah-adjacent interviewer played by Celia Ward, represents the other half of the equation, the possibility that a sympathetic, well-produced interview might begin to shift the public narrative that Ellen Abbott has spent weeks constructing around Nick's guilt. Bolt wants to control all variables. Sharon Shiba represents an uncontrollable one. Nick, who is increasingly unwilling to simply sit in the defensive crouch of the accused, chooses to do the interview anyway. The preparation for the interview is one of the film's quietly funny sequences. Tanner Bolt coaching Nick through the correct emotional register. Not too grieved, not too composed, don't smile, don't cross your arms, say Amy's name 3 times in the first 5 minutes. is both a parody of media training and a completely accurate depiction of it. Affleck plays Nick, receiving this coaching, with the expression of a man being asked to perform a version of himself that he recognizes as artificial but needs to be believable. There's an absurdity to the whole apparatus that the film acknowledges without quite breaking into full comedy. The interview itself, when it happens, is fascinating in its mechanics. Nick, coached and prepared and dressed by people who understand the semiotics of televised grief, sits across from Sharon Sheber and does something that surprises everyone. He's good at it. The warmth that's been inaccessible in his police interactions and press conference appearances finds a way out in the context of a one-on-one conversation with a sympathetic interviewer. He talks about Amy with a specificity, particular moments, private jokes, the texture of their early love that reads as genuine because it is. Nick's failure has never been a failure of feeling. He loved Amy. He was also terrible to her. Both of these things are true, and the interview catches the first truth in a way that the investigation has been almost exclusively focused on documenting the second. The interview's aftermath is immediate and significant. Public opinion begins to shift. The comments change. Ellen Abbott's certainty wavers slightly on air, which for Abbott is the equivalent of a structural collapse. The nation begins to entertain the possibility that Nick Dunne might be a deeply flawed man who nonetheless did not kill his wife. Amy, watching from the lake house with Desi's hand on her shoulder, watches Nick on the Sheber interview. And her face does something extraordinary. Something that Pike plays with the control of a pianist, finding a note they've been hunting. She is moved, not in the way of a woman who's been reminded why she loved him, in the way of a woman who is watching her plans start to slip and is already calculating the next move. The investigation shifts. Detective Bonnie, credit where it's due, doesn't abandon the case when public opinion starts warming to Nick. She does something more interesting. She starts pulling threads that weren't in the original design. Noel Hawthorne, Amy's supposed close friend in North Carthage, played by Casey Wilson, with a particular, specific obliviousness that functions as the film's comic relief valve, provides Bonnie with the diary, having found it in Amy's belongings, and Bonnie reads it as evidence, as she is supposed to. But Bonnie is also smart enough to notice that the handwriting, the paper, the ink, everything about the physical diary is consistent with recent production rather than years of accumulated entries. A forensic document examiner is brought in. This is the investigation beginning to find the actual shape of what happened. Not because Nick has been cooperative or because the media narrative has been illuminating, but because Bonnie is good at her job and Amy, brilliant as she is, has left traces that she couldn't fully eliminate. The physical evidence of the diary's manufacture is one of those traces. Another is Desi Collings, who has a documented history of obsession with Amy, who was lobbed by his own security system driving to his lake house with Amy in the passenger seat, and who does not appear to realize that this is information anyone could access. Bonnie is 3 moves behind Amy at any given moment, but she is moving and the gap is closing. What the second act is about, thematically, let's pull back for a moment and look at what Act 2 is doing at the level of theme, because the plot mechanics are dense enough that it's easy to lose the argumentative thread. The film's second act is structurally organized around the question of what marriage does to the people inside it. Both Nick's storyline and Amy's are, in their different ways, about how the institution of marriage, with all its public dimensions, its legal dimensions, its performative requirements, has made both of these characters into versions of themselves that neither of them fully controls. Nick's affair with Andy is not presented as simply a moral failing, though it is that. It's presented as a man reasserting a version of himself. Younger, unencumbered, not yet the person that the marriage required him to be, that the marriage has suppressed. His happiness in the early affair scenes has the specific, slightly desperate quality of someone who's been living in a role that doesn't fit and has briefly taken it off. He's not escaping Amy. He's escaping the performance of being Amy's husband. Amy's elaborate plan is the same dynamic taken to its extreme logical conclusion. She didn't just take off the performance, she demolished the stage. She is refusing, at enormous and creative cost, to continue being what the marriage required her to be. Not just Amazing Amy, but the woman who performs Amazing Amy for a husband who lost interest in the performance. The violence of her exit is proportional to the violence she felt the performance requirement had done to her. Neither of these arguments justifies either character's behavior. Both of them explain it. And the film asks you to hold the explanation and the judgment simultaneously, not to let one cancel the other, which is again the specific moral complexity that makes this film worth the extended analysis it's receiving right now. The lake house scenes are where Gone Girl enters its most morally vertiginous territory, and Fincher knows it. He shoots the Collings property with a beauty that's almost aggressive. The lake glittering outside floor to ceiling windows, the interior architecture clean and considered and deeply, deeply wrong. Everything in Desi's house is curated for Amy and simultaneously about Desi. The flowers he's placed on the nightstand are her favorite variety. The wardrobe he's stocked for her reflects her taste precisely. The whole space is a monument to how well he knows her, and knowing someone this precisely, this comprehensively, without their participation or consent, that's not love, that's a dossier. Rosamund Pike's physical performance in the lake house scenes is extraordinary in a specific way. She plays Amy as a woman who has recalibrated her performance entirely for a single-person audience. Everything about how Amy moves in front of Desi is designed for Desi. The slight vulnerability she allows in her posture when he enters a room, the carefully managed gratitude in her voice, warm enough to maintain his investment, never so warm that it becomes unambiguous. The way she lets him believe, incrementally, that the old connection they had is reconstituting itself, that she is beginning to see him as he wants to be seen. This is Amy at the absolute apex of her operational sophistication. She is inside a cage that she walked into deliberately, performing recovery for a man whose obsession she is using as a tool, while planning the next stage of a scheme that has already required months of preparation. And the performance is flawless. Desi sees what he wants to see. He always has. Desi as mirror Neil Patrick Harris plays Desi Collings with a studied, surface-level pleasantness that is one of the film's more quietly unsettling achievements. He is not a villain in the traditional sense. He doesn't twirl, he doesn't threaten overtly, he never raises his voice. What he does is something more mundane and, the film argues, more genuinely dangerous. He loves Amy the way you love a possession, with care, with attention, with the absolute confidence of someone who has decided they know what's good for you better than you do. The control in the lake house is never stated explicitly. It accumulates in small moments, each individually dismissible but collectively suffocating. Desi mentioning, gently, that he's taken the liberty of adjusting Amy's diet while she's recovering, she'll feel so much better. Desi explaining apologetically that he's had to lock the exterior doors at night. For security reasons, you understand, it's just while things are unsettled. Desi presenting her clothing options for the day with the manner of someone doing her a favor. Each of these gestures is performed as concern. Together, they constitute captivity. What Harris finds in Desi, and this is the casting insight at its deepest level, is the specific psychology of a man who has convinced himself completely that his control is love. He is not performing care to mask cruelty. He genuinely believes the performance. He thinks Amy is lucky to be here. He thinks he saved her. The tragedy of his situation, insofar as the film is willing to grant him a tragedy, is that he might have, in a different version of this story, with a different Amy, been right. Instead, he has saved a woman who is assembling the materials of his destruction and who hasn't felt safe for a single moment since she arrived. The dynamic between Desi and Amy in these scenes also serves the film's larger thematic argument that the structures of heterosexual domestic life, the man who provides shelter and security, the woman who receives it with grace and gratitude, contain within them a power asymmetry that most participants normalize without examining. Desi's behavior is an exaggerated version of something the film has been tracking across the entire Dunne marriage. The way that care and control can be made indistinguishable from each other in a domestic context, and the way that indistinguishability is almost always resolved in favor of the person with more structural power. Amy weaponizes this, but first she builds the weapon. Building the next frame, what Amy is doing in the lake house, beyond waiting, beyond surviving, is constructing the second act of her story. The first act of the frame was the disappearance, the staged crime scene, the diary, the designed evidence pointing toward Nick's guilt. That act was designed to destroy Nick. But Nick, with Tanner Bohr's guidance and the Shaber interview, is beginning to claw his way back from the edge of a murder charge. The public narrative is shifting. Amy, watching this from Daisy's lake house, is revising. The second act of the frame, the one she is now constructing, is the return. A missing woman who comes home is a different story than a missing woman who stays missing. A missing woman who comes home beaten, traumatized, with physical evidence of captivity and assault, and worse, that woman doesn't face questions about where she's been. She receives sympathy, protection, the full machinery of institutional care, and the man she identifies as her captor, the man whose DNA she will have taken care to deposit in specific places, faces a charge that is not circumstantial. That charge carries a very long sentence. Amy has to be patient. She has to let the frame develop at the right pace. She has to let Dizzy believe for long enough that his behavioral patterns are established on his own security cameras, that their arrangement has his explicit consent and her willing participation. She needs evidence of the cage before she can use the cage as a story. Fincher shoots Amy in the lake house with a specific framing strategy. She is almost always observed through glass, through the windows of the lake house, through the reflection in mirrors, through the transparent surfaces of the sleek, beautiful cage she is inhabiting. It's an elegant visual choice, one that rhymes with the film's opening image of Amy observed from outside, and it keeps the camera at the slight remove of the witness rather than the intimate angle of the confidant. We see Amy, we don't quite access her. The glass is always there. What Nick does with what he knows. Nick Dunne, in the second half of Act 2, makes the discovery that should destroy him and doesn't, because by this point, the film has done enough work on the audience's sympathies that we are rooting for him even as we understand why we shouldn't be entirely. Following the treasure hunt to its conclusion, Nick finds Amy's clue in the bar's ceiling. The final location, the final gift, the anniversary destination that Amy has been leading him to the entire time. And what he finds there is not the answer but something better and worse. Enough information to understand at last that this wasn't a murder. It was a disappearance. It was planned. Amy is alive. Affleck plays the dawning of this comprehension across several takes that Fincher stitched together with characteristic precision. It's not relief, although relief is present, because the understanding that Amy is alive is immediately followed by the understanding of what it means that Amy is alive. She didn't disappear. She left. She constructed all of this. The diary, the evidence, the public narrative. None of it was real, which means Nick has been walking through a designed reality for weeks, touching walls that were painted sets, talking to investigators who were seeing what Amy built for them to see. He has been, in the most complete possible sense, played. There's a moment where Affleck lets Nick's face hold both possibilities. The profound relief of knowing Amy is alive and the equally profound, nauseating awareness of what Amy's being alive means. And it's the best acting in his performance. Not the press conferences, not the interview, not the confrontations with Bonnie. This private moment in the bar ceiling where nobody is watching, where there are no cameras, where the information lands without mediation. Affleck holds it just long enough for you to see both truths registering simultaneously, and then Nick's face does what Nick's face always does in a crisis. It closes. It becomes controlled. It becomes the face he shows the world rather than the face the world just tried to break. Margot hears the truth. Nick tells Margot. Of course he tells Margot. She is, as established, the one person he cannot perform for convincingly. The person whose knowledge of him predates every performance he's constructed for the outside world. The scene where Nick sits across from Margot and explains what he now believes happened is one of the film's most efficient and emotionally concentrated moments. Carrie Coon's response, the specific, layered process of a woman absorbing information that requires her to simultaneously update her understanding of Nick, of Amy, and of the entire landscape of the past weeks, plays out in her face in real time. She doesn't have lines that do this work. The work happens in her eyes, in the fractional adjustments of her expression, in the way she breathes. Coon was in her early 30s when this film was shot and had a theatre actor's command of stillness. You can see the theatrical training here in the best possible way, not as stage technique but as the capacity to fill a pause with something that the camera can actually find. What Margot says once she's had a moment, holy shit, which is exactly right. No speech, no analysis, Just the honest human response to information this large and this strange. The film earns this reaction because it's earned everything that precedes it, but it's also a specifically Fincher choice. The flat, unglamorous articulation of crisis rather than the heightened cinematic version. Kuhn plays it straight, and straight is perfect. Tanner Bolt's revised assessment. The scene where Nick brings this new understanding to Tanner Bolt is the film's most operatically funny scene, and Tyler Perry knows it. Bolt, upon being informed that his client's wife staged her own disappearance to frame him for murder and is currently alive and in hiding, does not react with the dramatic horror of a television lawyer confronting impossible information. He reacts with the focused, almost gleeful interest of a man who has just been handed the most interesting case of his career. The legal problem is unprecedented. The human problem is extraordinary. Bolt's face doesn't fall, it brightens, which is the specific, disturbing brightness of a person for whom complexity is not a burden but an invitation. Tyler Perry is playing a particular kind of intelligence here. The intelligence that gets energized by obstacles rather than discouraged by them. And the performance is precise in a way that Perry's critics, who associated him primarily with the Madhya franchise, weren't expecting. He makes Bolt's pleasure in the problem completely convincing and only faintly monstrous. The slight monstrousness is the point. Bolt is not a good man in the conventional sense. He is an excellent attorney, which is a different and sometimes overlapping category. His immediate pivot to strategy. What does Nick do with what he knows? How does he use it without appearing to know it? How does knowing Amy is alive become a legal and tactical asset rather than a liability? Structures the final act's procedural layer. Bolt has been working to keep Nick from being charged with murder. Now he's working to get Amy home in a way that keeps Nick alive after she arrives. These are not the same problem, and the film is honest about that. The physical evidence. Amy is building. Let's talk about what Amy is actually doing in the lake house when she's not performing recovery for Desi, because the film includes this, not graphically, not sensationally, but clearly and deliberately, and it matters. Amy is building a body of evidence. She is documenting, methodically and with the patience that characterizes everything she does, a record of captivity. She is saving every instance of Desi's behavioral control in her memory, knowing his cameras are recording hers. She is doing something to her body that the film implies in the structure of later scenes rather than depicting directly. She is, in the full sense of the term, preparing her exit. This is where Gone Girl becomes genuinely difficult to watch, not because of any graphic content, but because of the clear-eyed intelligence with which it depicts Amy doing something terrible as a means of escaping something she has, in part through her own design, made terrible. The lake house is a cage of her own constructing. Desi's obsession is real, but she walked into it deliberately, and yet the cage is a real cage. The obsession is a real obsession. The loss of agency she experiences at Desi's hands, however she engineered the conditions of that loss, is functionally real in the moment she is living through it. The film doesn't resolve this knot, it tightens it. Amy is a victim of the circumstances she created. She is also the architect of those circumstances. Both are completely true. The film's willingness to hold this, to neither excuse her because she was controlled nor condemn her simply because she was controlling, is what gives Act 2B its specific, unresolvable discomfort. The texture of the lake house days. There's a quality of suspended time in the lake house sequences that Fincher achieves through pacing and sound design as much as through narrative content. Days pass. Amy reads. Desi watches her. The lake sits outside the window, beautiful and still, indifferent to everything happening on its shore. Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross's score during these sections is worth a specific note here because it's doing something different from the propulsive unease of the investigation sequences. In the lake house, the music breathes differently, longer, slower phrases with the quality of something patient and subterranean. It sounds like waiting. It sounds like water. It sounds like a woman who has all the time she needs because she is the one controlling the clock. Even inside a room, she can't leave. The silence between the score's phrases is as important as the phrases themselves. Reznor and Ross are composers who understand rest, who understand that what you don't hear shapes what you do hear in ways that are felt before they're analyzed. In the lake house, the silences have weight. They have the specific weight of things being not said, performances being maintained, truths being kept in very careful boxes. Amy Dunne, in these scenes, is in complete control of a situation she has no physical power in. That paradox is the entire film in miniature, and it's about to explode. It happens fast. That's the first thing to say about Amy's return. Fincher shoots it with a velocity that's almost shocking after the slow, suspended patience of the lake house sequences. One moment, Amy is in Desi's bedroom. The next, the thing she has been building toward in those long, quiet days by the water is complete, and she is standing in the street outside her and Nick's North Carthage home, covered in blood, with the police and media arriving simultaneously, and the story she has constructed is the only story anyone in that crowd is going to hear tonight. The mechanics of what Amy did to Dizzy, how she used the evidence she'd assembled, how she used the materials of the cage itself to engineer her exit. The film depicts with a restraint that's more disturbing than any amount of graphic detail could be. What we understand is clear enough. What Fincher doesn't show us is also doing work. The absence of the explicit forces you to reconstruct it in your own mind, and what your mind reconstructs tends to be shaped by your own relationship to the film's moral architecture. If you've been watching Amy as a victim, you reconstruct something defensive. If you've been watching Amy as a predator, you reconstruct something calculated. The film is clever enough to know that both reconstructions are correct. She walks out of the lake house and into the road and flags down a passing car with the composed deliberateness of someone executing the final step of a plan. And the driver who stops sees exactly what Amy needs them to see: a woman in terrible distress, injured, frightened, in need of help. The performance is impeccable. It always is. Nick gets the call. Nick Dunne is in the bar, the constant, the anchor point of his North Carthage life. When Margot calls him, Amy has been found. Amy is alive. Amy is on her way to the hospital and asking for Nick. Affleck plays this moment with the most restrained reaction available to him, which is the right choice. After everything, the investigation, the media trial, the affair coming to light, the weeks of mounting evidence designed to point toward him as a murderer, the news that his wife is alive should produce something enormous. But Nick Dunne doesn't produce enormous things in public. He produces careful things, controlled things. What Affleck gives you is a man standing very still while something large and indescribable moves through him, and then, because the cameras are already on the way to the hospital and Nick knows the cameras are on the way, he starts calculating. He drives to the hospital, and when he walks through the doors and the cameras find him and people begin to cry and reach for him with the particular relieved warmth of a community that has just had its nightmare ended, Nick Dunne does what Nick Dunne has always done under surveillance. He performs. He performs the overwhelmed husband. He performs relief. He is, at this point in the film, so thoroughly inside the logic of performance that you cannot tell, you genuinely cannot tell, even watching carefully, where the performance ends and the actual feeling begins. Maybe Nick can't tell either. That might be the point. The hospital room. Two survivors. The scene where Nick first sees Amy in the hospital bed is the film's emotional fulcrum, and it's shot with a deliberate intimacy that the rest of the film has been carefully withholding. The room is small. The lighting is the soft, controlled warmth of a medical setting trying to feel human. Amy is in the bed, bandaged and pale, with the specific, refined fragility of a woman who has calculated the precise degree of fragility that reads as survivor rather than victim in progress. Nick enters. The room clears, nurses, police, Bonnie, and for the first time since the film's opening frames, these two people are alone together. What passes between them in this scene is one of the most extraordinary passages of acting in the film, because neither character says what they mean, and both characters know that the other knows what they mean, and the entire conversation takes place underneath its own stated surface. Amy speaks in the language of reunion, relief, love, gratitude, the trembling vulnerability of someone who's been through something terrible. Nick responds in the language of a man who knows what happened and cannot say so, answering her performance with his own performance, matching register for register in a grotesque dance of mutual knowing. Rosamund Pike's eyes in this scene are doing something that can't be described as anything other than watching. Amy is watching Nick understand. She's watching him realize the full scope of what she's done and what it means that she's done it successfully. And there's a satisfaction in that watching that she is barely, exquisitely containing beneath the performance of the overwhelmed survivor. Pike finds this with a precision that gives me chills every single time, no matter how many times I've seen the film. The warmth in her expression toward Nick in these moments is completely real and completely predatory simultaneously. The satisfaction of a chess player whose opponent has finally understood the board. Nick, for his part, plays the scene with a kind of terrible tenderness. The tenderness of a man who is trapped and knows he is trapped and is choosing, in this moment, to let Amy see that he knows, as a way of asserting that one small thing, his awareness. I see you, I know what you did. You cannot take that from me, even if you can take everything else. He leans in. He kisses her forehead. The cameras outside the window capture it. The image goes national within minutes. The loving husband and his recovered wife. The nightmare over. The story resolved. Detective Bonnie's last move. Give Bonnie her due. She doesn't let it go. With Amy back, the institutional pressure to close the case is enormous. The DA's office has no appetite for a prosecution that targets a man whose wife has just returned home. The media, which spent weeks building the case against Nick, pivots with the oil spill smoothness of a narrative ecosystem that doesn't acknowledge prior contradictions. Now, the story is reunion, resilience, survival. Ellen Abbott's show runs a special. The candles come back out, this time for celebration. Bonnie sits in her car outside the Dunne house and reviews what she knows. What she knows, at this point, is substantial, the forensic analysis of the diary, which suggests recent manufacture rather than years of accumulated writing. Desi Collings' security footage, which she's been quietly building into a parallel timeline. The physical evidence from the lake house, which tells a story if you're willing to read it against Amy's version rather than alongside it. The behavioral analysis of Amy's first hours after rescue. The specific, too-measured calm of a woman who has been through extraordinary trauma without quite behaving as extraordinary trauma usually produces. None of this is enough. Legally, structurally, politically, none of it is enough. Amy has been too thorough. The frame she built around Desi is airtight. The physical evidence she prepared too persuasive. The institutional momentum of a resolved missing woman case, too powerful to reverse with the circumstantial doubts of a single investigator. Bonnie knows. And knowing in this film is not the same as being able to do anything about knowing. Kim Dickens plays Bonnie's final scenes with a quiet that functions differently from the quiet of her earlier watchfulness. Earlier in the film, Bonnie's quiet was active, the focused stillness of someone gathering information. Now it's the quiet of a person who has gathered the information and arrived at a conclusion that the system around her cannot accommodate. It's not defeat, exactly. It's something more permanent than defeat. It's the particular exhaustion of a professional who has encountered the limits of what professionalism can accomplish when the person it's investigating has designed those limits into the situation. She lets it go. She doesn't forget it, but she lets it go, and the film honors her enough to show us that she knows. Nick's press conference, take 2. The second press conference. Amy and Nick together, the perfect couple restored. The American Nightmare ended, is a masterpiece of tonal horror that the film plays almost entirely straight. Nick stands beside Amy at the microphone and says the things that the situation requires. Amy says the things that the situation requires. They hold hands, they look at each other with the specific, perform intimacy that has been the entire film's subject. The gathered crowd responds with the warmth and relief of people who needed the story to end this way, who invested in the narrative of the wronged husband and the recovered wife and are receiving their payoff. Fincher shoots this with a flatness, a near total absence of editorial comment in the camera work that is more devastating than any amount of obvious irony could be. He doesn't underline the horror of what we are watching. He just presents it, neutrally, accurately, and trusts you to feel the wrongness in your bones. Two people standing in front of cameras performing a marriage that has become something that doesn't have a word for it. Not love, not hate, not even mutual destruction, exactly, because destruction implies an ending. What Nick and Amy have now is something without an ending. Tyler Perry, magnificent as always, watches the press conference from the side of the room with the expression of a man who has seen this precise situation before in a different configuration and is updating his priors for future reference. Bolt knows. Margot knows. Margot knows. The film has taken care to put every competent character in the film in a position of knowing and given that knowledge nowhere to go, and the effect is suffocating in a way that's entirely appropriate to the material. Margot's verdict. After the press conference, Margot tells Nick she's leaving. This scene, brief, private, brutal, in the way that only truly close relationships can deliver brutality, is Carrie Coon's finest moment in a film full of fine moments. She's not angry at Nick in any straightforward way. She's not leaving because she hates him or because she's given up. She's leaving because she is a person who requires honesty as a foundational condition of love. And Nick's life from this point forward will be built on the most comprehensively dishonest arrangement imaginable, and she cannot live adjacent to it. What Coon does with the line she's given, the way she says goodbye to Nick without saying goodbye, without naming what she's doing, without explaining, because explaining would require a vocabulary that doesn't exist for this situation, is a piece of emotional acting that the film's critical discourse has underserved. She's been underserved, generally, in the awards conversation. The performance that won Rosamund Pike her nomination was extraordinary and deserved. Coon's performance, which held the film's human center without ever demanding the spotlight, was the invisible infrastructure of everything the film successfully makes you feel. When Margot walks out of the frame, something the film has been relying on as ballast walks out with her. What remains is Nick, Amy, and the house. The arrangement, the story, the Sheber interview aftermath, a detail worth tracking in the film's third act, the way it handles Sharon Sheber's program in the aftermath of Amy's return. Earlier in the film, the Sheber interview was Nick's attempt to reclaim the narrative, to get his version of the marriage in front of an audience that had been fed only Ellen Abbott's version. It worked, partially. Now Sheber's program covers Amy's return with the same uncritical warmth with which it covered Nick's defense. The show doesn't ask difficult questions about the timeline. It doesn't probe the inconsistencies in Amy's account of the lake house. It provides the platform that the audience wants, the reunion, the survival, the happy ending, and accepts Amy's narrative at face value with a thoroughness. That is, the film quietly suggests, the other side of the same coin as Abbott's prosecution, before evidence approach. Both programs are doing the same thing. Abbott built a story that fit the template of the guilty husband narrative. Sheber builds a story that fits the template of the survivor's return narrative. Neither program is in the business of disturbing a good narrative with inconvenient complications. The medium rewards the clean story, and both women, in their very different registers, are extraordinarily good at delivering it. Flynn has noted in interviews that this parallel was deliberate. The film is not arguing that the problem is bad actors in the media ecosystem. It's arguing that the incentive structures of the ecosystem produce the same fundamental distortion regardless of the individual journalist's intentions or competence. Good journalists and bad journalists in a clicks and ratings environment converge on the same behavior because that behavior is what the environment rewards. Gone Girl is a systems argument dressed as a thriller, and Sheber's uncritical coverage of Amy's return is the systems argument's final exhibit. The trap closes. The final shape of the trap becomes clear in the last minutes before the film's climax, and it's worth mapping precisely. Amy is home. Desi is dead, with evidence that thoroughly corroborates Amy's account and will sustain no prosecutable challenge. The media narrative is settled. Bonnie has nowhere to take her doubts. Nick has knowledge without recourse. He knows Amy is not what she appears and cannot say so without appearing to blame his traumatized wife for her own kidnapping. And then Amy tells Nick she's pregnant. This is the film's masterstroke, and it's audacious enough that I want to give it a sentence of space before we analyze it. Amy Dunne tells Nick Dunne she is pregnant with his child, a pregnancy engineered using stored samples from the fertility clinic they visited during the period when their marriage was still officially a marriage, and in doing so completes the trap because Nick cannot leave. not publicly, not legally, not without destroying whatever remnant of the post-press conference rehabilitation his image has managed to accumulate. A man who leaves his recovering, pregnant wife, regardless of what he knows about who she is and what she's done, is not a sympathetic figure in any media ecosystem Amy cares about. She has built the cage that Desi built for her, except she has built it correctly. She has built it out of the specific materials of Nick's own life, his own body, his own public image. The bars are made of things that he can't remove without destroying himself. It's brilliant in the way that genuinely terrible things can be brilliant, and the film asks you to see both the brilliance and the terror simultaneously. Nick looks at Amy and says, very quietly, I hate you. Amy looks at Nick and says, with the smile of a woman who has won, I know. There is no clean ending to Gone Girl. There is only the last frame, that same image of the back of Amy's head that opened the film, the camera pulling back, Nick's voiceover returning, and the specific, airless feeling of a story that has sealed itself shut around the people inside it, not a resolution, a finality. These are different things, and understanding the distinction is the key to understanding why the ending generates as much unease on the fifth viewing as it does on the first. Let's begin with what the final act gives Nick before it takes everything from him. After Amy reveals the pregnancy, Nick has a window, brief, narrowing, closing by the minute, in which he considers his options. Fincher shoots this deliberation not as a scene of contemplative solitude, but as a series of Nick in motion, driving, walking, sitting in the bar after hours, moving through the house with the restless, directionless energy of a man in a cage who hasn't yet accepted that the cage is real. Affleck plays this beautifully, not with obvious anguish, not with cinematic torment, but with the specific quality of a man who is thinking very hard about something that thinking cannot solve. He writes. He writes a document, not a diary, not in Amy's medium, but something more legally intentioned. He writes what he knows. He writes what happened. He writes a version of the truth that exists as testimony, even if it never reaches anyone who can use it. The writing is a private act of assertion. I was here. I know what occurred. The story being told publicly is not the story. It won't change anything. Nick knows it won't change anything. He writes it anyway, and the film grants him this, the dignity of having his version exist somewhere, even in a drawer, even in a document that will likely never be opened by anyone whose opinion matters. This is the film extending Nick Dunne the only courtesy it can, given the situation it's put him in. He cannot win. He cannot escape. He cannot even, within the social reality the film has constructed, speak the truth without destroying himself more completely than silence will. But he can know, he can record the knowing, and in a film about the violence of narrative control, about who gets to tell the story, whose version becomes real, this small private act of authorship carries genuine weight. The final confrontation. The scene where Nick confronts Amy directly, not in the hospital, not in the managed language of press conferences and performances, but in the house, alone, with no cameras and no audience, is the film's most nakedly theatrical moment, and it works precisely because Fincher has earned the theatricality by withholding it for 2.5 hours. Nick tells Amy what he knows. Not accusatorially, he is past accusation, which implies the possibility of consequence, but flatly, factually, with the specific economy of a man who has organized his understanding and wants to place it on the record between them. He knows about the diary, he knows about Desi, he knows about the pregnancy's engineering. He knows that Amy, the real Amy, the one who exists beneath the diary and the press conferences and the curated amber of their constructed romantic history, is something that he never actually knew at all. Amy listens. She does what Amy Dunne always does when receiving information. She processes it, she evaluates its tactical implications, and she chooses her response not based on what she feels, but based on what serves the architecture of the situation she's maintaining. She doesn't deny, she doesn't apologize, she doesn't explain in the way that explanation implies remorse. She simply, and this is the most devastating thing she does in the entire film, makes the argument for why Nick should stay. The argument is not coercive in the crude sense. It's not a threat, exactly, though the threat is present underneath it like the river under ice. It's an argument about complicity, about what they are to each other now, about the strange and terrible intimacy that has developed between two people who know each other this completely and this badly. Amy argues, essentially, that what she and Nick have now, this mutual knowledge, this mutual captivity, this arrangement of total honesty hidden inside total public performance, is more real than anything they had before. That the marriage they perform for the cameras is false, yes, but the knowledge they hold between them is truer than any marriage founded on ordinary ignorance. It's a monstrous argument. It's also not entirely wrong. And Nick, who is standing in the rubble of his own life, looking at this woman who dismantled it, finds that he cannot fully counter it. Not because he agrees, but because the counter argument requires a version of moral clarity that this situation has comprehensively destroyed. What I hate you I know actually means the exchange at the center of the third act's climax. Nick's I hate you and Amy's I know has been quoted and analyzed enough that it risks becoming shorthand, a meme-sized compression of the film's complexity. Let's resist that. I hate you from Nick is not a simple declaration. It's the most honest thing Nick Dunne says in the entire film, and honesty is not what Nick typically traffics in. The man who managed his affair, his financial troubles, his emotional absence from the marriage through evasion and compartmentalization is, in this moment, incapable of managing anything. The sentence has no strategy in it. It's just true. It's the articulation of the state of being trapped by something you cannot escape and cannot forgive and cannot simply stop feeling the full weight of all at once with nowhere to put any of it. Amy's I know is the more complex of the two responses. It contains, in two syllables, the entire quality of her character, the acknowledgement that his hatred is correct, the absence of shame about it, the specific satisfaction of a woman who has achieved a comprehensiveness of knowing that renders Nick's hatred simply another data point she has accounted for. She expected this. She built for this. His hatred is, in her emotional ecosystem, the expected weather. She dressed for it. But there's something else in I know, something softer and stranger that Pike finds in the delivery that I think gets overlooked in the quote's cultural circulation. It's not only triumphant, it's also faintly lonely. The loneliness of a person whose brilliance has created an arrangement in which the only possible connection is one built on mutual captivity and mutual knowledge and mutual performance. In which love, whatever that was, has been replaced by something that is its own kind of intimacy but has no warmth in it. Amy knows that Nick hates her. She also knows, in the specific and terrible way that only two people who have been this thoroughly inside each other's lives can know, that hate and love in a marriage of this density are not opposites. They're the same muscle. She has won completely. She is also, in a very specific and irreparable way, alone. The final frame and the opening echo. The film's last image is, as I mentioned at the outset, the back of Amy's head. Nick's voiceover returns. What are you thinking? How are you feeling? What have we done to each other? What will we do? The same questions, the same image, the camera at the same predatory creep, but everything the image contains has changed. In the opening, the questions felt like the melancholy of a marriage gone distant, sad, recognizable, the universal ache of two people who have stopped fully accessing each other. The back of a head as a metaphor for unknowability, for the way long intimacy can produce its own form of opacity. The camera's creep as the universal experience of looking at someone you love and wondering what's actually happening inside them. At the end of the film, the questions are the same, and the image is the same, and the metaphor is the same. But the unknowability has been revealed as something entirely different from ordinary marital distance. Nick doesn't know what Amy is thinking because Amy's interiority is a performance constructed for audiences she has chosen, and Nick will never be in the audience again. Not really, not in any way that matters. The creep of the camera is no longer the metaphor of love's limitation. It's the surveillance of a man watching a woman he cannot leave and cannot trust for the rest of his life in the house they share. Fincher makes this mirror structure work by not underlining it. He trusts the audience to have been watching carefully enough to feel the transformation of the same image by everything the film has placed between its first and last occurrence. The technique is classical in the best sense. The callback that rewards attention rather than flagging itself for those who weren't paying. And it's the finishing note of a film that has been precise in its construction from the first frame to the last. What Nick writes in the end. The document Nick writes. His testimony, his record, ends with a question rather than an answer, and Flynn and Fincher are smart enough to not show us exactly what he writes. We see him writing. We see the intention. We don't see the content. This is the right choice because any specific content would narrow the film's final ambiguity in ways that would diminish it. What Nick writes is whatever version of the truth Nick can articulate, which means it's still Nick's version, still filtered through his perspective and his limitations and his own significant catalogue of failures within this marriage. His truth is not the full truth. Amy's diary was not the full truth. The film has no full truth to offer, and the honesty of that, the decision not to produce a version of events that we can accept as reliable, is what gives Gone Girl its lasting unresolvability. You leave the theatre, or the couch, or wherever you watched it, not with answers, but with the specific disquiet of a person who has been inside a story that refused to tell them what to think and trusted them, somewhat aggressively, to think for themselves. Who is the victim here? Who is the villain? Is this a film about male violence? About female manipulation? About the institution of marriage as a mechanism of mutual diminishment? About the media's capacity to distort any reality into a consumable narrative? About the impossibility of truly knowing another person regardless of how close you get? Yes, all of those simultaneously, without hierarchy, and the film has the courage, the specific, rare courage of work that trusts its audience completely, to leave every single one of those arguments open at the final cut. The pregnancy as the film's final argument. Let me close the story analysis section by returning to the pregnancy, because it's the film's final structural argument and it deserves a clean reading. Amy's use of Nick's stored fertility clinic samples to engineer a pregnancy without his knowledge or consent is legally a significant violation. It is also, and the film makes this parallel explicitly, structurally identical to the kind of reproductive control that the law and cultural practice have historically exercised over women. Amy does to Nick, in this one specific domain, what patriarchal structures have done to women throughout documented history. She removes his agency over his own reproduction in service of her strategic goals, and she presents the outcome as something he should accept because the alternative is worse. Flynn has spoken about this in interviews. The deliberate gender reversal of reproductive coercion as one of the film's most provocative structural choices. Amy is not presented as a feminist hero for doing this. She is presented as a person who has adopted the strategies of her oppressors and deployed them against the specific man who, in her accounting, represents those structures. That adoption doesn't make the strategy feminist. It makes it symmetrically monstrous. The film is not endorsing Amy's tactics. It's noting, with the cold precision of a surgeon, that the tactics exist, that the power dynamics that produce them exist, and that a brilliant and ruthless person with sufficient grievance and access to the tools can use those dynamics regardless of the gender of the person deploying them. That's not a comfortable argument. It's not supposed to be. Gone Girl is, at its deepest level, a film about discomfort, about the discomfort of acknowledging that the structures we live inside produce terrible outcomes even when operated by intelligent, educated people with full knowledge of their own behavior. Nick and Amy are not stupid. They are not evil in the cartoon sense. They are two people inside an institution and a media ecosystem and a class dynamic that has made them both into something they can't fully see or escape. The pregnancy is the institution's final move, played by the person who understood the institution's rules best. Nick is going to be a father. Amy is going to be a mother. They are going to raise a child inside the arrangement. The cameras will be there. The performance will continue. What will we do? David Fincher has worked with cinematographer Jeff Cronenweth on 5 films: Fight Club, The Social Network, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, Gone Girl, and Mank, and their collaboration has produced some of the most distinctive visual grammar in contemporary American cinema. But Gone Girl is, I'd argue, the fullest realization of what their shared aesthetic can accomplish, because the subject matter and the visual language are in such perfect, unsettling alignment. This is a film about watching and being watched, about the gap between surfaces and what lies beneath them, about the way images are constructed and consumed. And Cronenberg shoots it with a camera that seems to know all of this, that participates in the film's thematic concerns rather than merely illustrating them. The starting point for understanding Cronenberg's work here is the concept of motivated surveillance. In most thrillers, the camera adopts a position of relatively neutral observation. It watches the story unfold from a position of implied objectivity, occasionally moving to emphasize a moment but fundamentally presenting itself as a transparent conduit for the narrative. Gone Girl's camera is never transparent, it watches. It observes with the specific, focused attention of something that has an agenda. When it circles Amy in the opening frames, when it holds on Nick's face at the press conference for precisely 2 beats longer than comfort allows, when it lingers on an empty room after a character has left, these are not neutral choices. The camera in Gone Girl is a surveillance device, and it's never entirely clear whose surveillance it represents. This quality, the sense of being watched by a camera with intentions you can't fully read, produces a specific kind of unease that pervades the film even in its quietest moments. You are never relaxed watching Gone Girl. You are always slightly aware of being observed yourself, which is the film's most intimate achievement. It makes the audience feel the condition that both its central characters are living inside. The two-color system. The film's visual architecture is built on a binary color system that operates as the most consistently deployed formal element in Cronenberg and Fincher's toolkit, and is precise enough to function almost as a second screenplay running underneath the written one. Nick's present tense investigation storyline lives in a cool, desaturated palette, the blues and grays of institutional spaces, the particular washed out quality of natural Missouri light in the summer heat that somehow never feels warm. Cronenberg achieves this through a combination of location selection, lighting design, and post-production color grading that strips the warmth from every frame of Nick's timeline with surgical consistency. Police stations, press conference rooms, the bar's functional interior, the Dunne house's lived-in, slightly depleted domestic spaces. All of these locations in any other film might carry warmth. The bar especially, which is narratively coded as Nick's comfort zone. In Gone Girl, the bar is as cool and grey as everything else in Nick's world. The color system doesn't make exceptions for narrative sentiment. Amy's diary flashback sequences, as established in the story analysis sections, operate in the opposing register amber, gold, the warm directional light of a Vermeer interior. The New York apartment that Amy and Nick shared before the Missouri move is lit and shot with an almost hallucinatory warmth, the quality of memory as it wants to be remembered rather than as it was. Candles, late afternoon, window light. The specific, soft focus of the camera on moments of intimacy that the film presents as genuine. Cronenberg and Fincher are being deliberate about this beauty. They are giving you a visual seduction to match the emotional one, making the diary sequences feel like the truth, because they look like warmth, and warmth is where we locate authenticity. The genius of this system is what it does at the film's midpoint revelation. When we follow Amy into the Ozarks motel and the diary's unreliability is confirmed, every frame of those amber diary sequences retroactively recalibrates in your memory. You weren't watching the past, you were watching a performance of the past, dressed in the visual language of authenticity. The warm light was the lie's costume. Cronenberg made the lie beautiful so that it would work on you the way it worked on Bonnie. And the moment of revelation is also unavoidably a moment of reckoning with your own willingness to be manipulated by a pretty image. The camera at distance. One of Cronenberg's most consistent strategies in Gone Girl is the maintenance of visual distance at moments of supposed intimacy. The camera placed slightly further from its subjects than convention dictates, observing rather than entering. In a conventional romantic drama, the camera moves close during intimate scenes, the close-up as the glamour of emotional access, the tight frame as the metaphor for two people genuinely allowing each other in. Gone Girl systematically subverts this. The scenes between Nick and Amy that should be intimate, their early courtship moments in the diary sequences, their hospital reunion, their final confrontation in the house, are consistently shot with a slight withdrawal, a frame that includes the space between characters rather than collapsing it. The intimacy is visible, but the camera refuses to participate in it. It watches from a carefully maintained remove. This is not coldness for its own sake, it is the visual enactment of the film's central epistemological problem. You cannot access these characters. You can observe them performing themselves for each other and for the camera, but the actual interiority, what Amy is actually thinking, what Nick is actually feeling, remains always just outside the frame's reach. The camera's distance from its subjects mirrors the audience's distance from the truth of what's happening in every room. We are watchers of a performance, and the camera's position never lets us forget it. The contrast with the film's handful of genuinely unguarded moments, Margot processing Nick's confession, Nick alone in the bar before he drives to the hospital, is telling. In those moments, the camera does move slightly closer, not intimate exactly, but attentive in a different way. These are moments of unperformed humanness, and the camera responds to them with a fractional shift toward presence. The difference is subtle enough that you may not consciously register it, but you feel it. You feel slightly more with the characters in those moments, slightly less like a surveillance device's feed. That's Cronenberg making the film's thematic argument through the vocabulary of focal length and frame distance. The Missouri landscape as character Fincher's decision to shoot extensively on location in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, rather than fabricating a Midwest aesthetic on a Los Angeles stage, pays documentary dividends throughout the film, but it's worth talking about the specific way Cronenberg's camera relates to the Missouri landscape, because it's not simply using the location as backdrop. The flatness of the Missouri terrain, the absence of dramatic topography, the way the land extends in every direction without offering the natural hiding places that mountains or dense forests provide, is shot as a visual argument about concealment. In this landscape, things disappear without the landscape's help. People go missing in flat places too, and the Mississippi River, which edges through several of the film's exterior sequences, provides the specific, indifferent quality of deep water, the sense that things put into it stay put into it, that the river doesn't remember and doesn't care and has been here for millions of years before any of this and will be here for millions of years after. The aerial shots of North Carthage, used sparingly but to significant effect, show the town in the context of its landscape with a quality that's almost documentary in its honesty. This is a real American place, not a theme park version of the Midwest, not an aestheticized rural poverty study, not a condescending portrait of the American interior. It's a town of a specific size, with a specific skyline and a specific relationship to the river beside it, and Cronenberg shoots it with the same respect for specific reality that he applies to every other element of the film's visual world. This specificity, the insistence on the real texture of the actual place rather than a cinematic approximation of it, is part of what makes the film's social critique land with the weight it does. The media circus that descends on North Carthage feels like a real incursion because North Carthage feels like a real place. The violation of the town's ordinary texture by the satellite trucks and the cable news stands and the national narrative apparatus has a visceral quality it couldn't have if the town were a set dressed to look like Missouri. Production design, the architecture of deception, the production design of Gone Girl, supervised by production designer Donald Graham Burt, a longtime Fincher collaborator who also worked on The Social Network, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, and Mank, is one of the film's most underappreciated formal achievements. The spaces in this film are not neutral containers for the action. They are arguments. The Dunne house, the central domestic space of the film, the site of Amy's staged crime, and Nick's investigation, is designed to communicate a very specific kind of American domestic aspiration in slight decline. The furniture is good without being exceptional. The rooms are spacious without being generous. The house has the quality of a space that was, at some point, the realization of someone's dream and has since settled into the slightly generic comfort of a life that continues without quite flourishing. It reads immediately as the house of two people who moved here from somewhere they preferred. Burt makes specific choices throughout the house that reward close attention. The kitchen, where the crime scenes, blood, and broken glass were staged, is designed in the warm neutrals of aspirational domestic life, and the intrusion of the crime scene evidence into this domestic warmth creates a specific visual dissonance that Detective Bonnie notices before she articulates it. The living room's mismatched furniture, some pieces clearly Amy's taste, some clearly Nick's, some clearly compromises that satisfied neither, tells a wordless story about the quality of the partnership that produced it. The contrast with the Collings Lake house couldn't be more pointed, where the Dunne house is lived in, imperfect, accumulated. Desi's lake house is showroom finished, every surface considered, every object selected rather than accumulated, the whole space expressing the taste of a person who has optimized his environment the way he has tried to optimize his relationships. It's beautiful and inhospitable in equal measure, which is precisely the correct quality for a cage that doesn't know it's a cage. The New York apartment. The film's third major domestic space, the New York apartment that Nick and Amy shared during the diary's courtship and early marriage sequences, is constructed on a Los Angeles soundstage rather than on location, and the construction shows deliberately. Bird designed the apartment with the specific quality of a memory palace rather than an actual lived space. Everything in it is slightly more beautiful, slightly more warmly lit, slightly more the platonic ideal of a New York literary couple's apartment than any such apartment in the real world. The books are arranged too perfectly, the light falls too consistently in the right direction. The textures, the worn wooden floors, the vintage kilim rugs, the open kitchen that always seems to have the right wine glasses on the counter, have the quality of objects selected for their aesthetic significance rather than simply used and kept. This is Amy's version of the space, remember. We are seeing the apartment the way Amy reconstructed it in the diary, which means we are seeing it the way Amy wanted it to be remembered. The physical environment idealized to match the emotional narrative she was constructing. The soundstage construction, rather than being a practical limitation the film works around, is a formal choice that the film deploys as content. The slight, uncanny perfection of the space is Amy's editing of reality made visible. When the film's amber palette drains from these sequences as the diary moves forward in time and the marriage deteriorates, the apartment changes with it, the same perfect space begins to feel slightly cold, slightly suffocating, the beautiful objects beginning to carry the quality of props in a production that's losing its audience's belief. Burt adjusts the design incrementally in ways so subtle they're felt rather than identified, until by the diary's final entries, the apartment that began as a love letter has become something that reads almost as a cell. Costume design and Amy's visual vocabulary. Trish Somerville, the costume designer who worked with Fincher on The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo and Gone Girl, makes choices for Amy Dunne that function as a secondary performance layer running underneath Rosamund Pike's primary one. Amy's wardrobe in the film's present tense sequences, before the disappearance, visible only in photographs and the crime scene, is assembled from what the film implies were her choices for a different life in a different city. Her clothes read as slightly expensive and slightly wrong for Missouri, the wardrobe of a Manhattan woman who moved to the Midwest without fully adapting her aesthetic self-presentation. They are not ostentatiously out of place. Amy is too controlled for that. But they have a quality of preserved identity, of a woman maintaining something of who she was in a context that keeps asking her to become something else. In the Ozarks motel sequences, Amy's deliberate transformation is visible in what she wears. Cheap, functional, generic. She has shed every marker of her actual identity and replaced it with the clothes of someone who has no identity worth marking. The deliberateness of this shedding, the specific, calculated quality of her chosen invisibility, is visible in how precisely the clothes don't fit her. Not physically, the fit is fine, but aesthetically, she wears ordinariness, the way a professional actor wears a costume, completely convincingly, with a slight remainder of the wearer visible underneath. At the lake house, Amy's wardrobe shifts again, Desi's selections for her, which reflect his vision of who Amy should be, slightly more elegant than she needs to be, slightly curated toward his taste rather than hers. The clothes are objectively beautiful. They fit perfectly. They are also not Amy's choices, and Somerville and Pike make this visible in how Amy inhabits them, wearing them with the specific quality of a woman who has learned to be comfortable inside constraints she didn't design. Her return wardrobe, the bloody destroyed clothes she wears on the night she comes home, is the film's most iconic costume choice, and its power is in its contrast with everything that preceded it: the destruction of the carefully maintained surface, the visible evidence on the clothing, the transformation of the put together woman into the survivor. It's the most theatrical costume choice in the film, and it's theatrical by design because it's Amy's most theatrical performance. Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross won the Academy Award for Best Original Score for The Social Network in 2011, their first collaboration with David Fincher, and the critical consensus around that score was that it had redefined what electronic music could accomplish in a dramatic film context, that it had made the cold, algorithmic world of Silicon Valley startup culture viscerally, emotionally felt through sound design that operated on the nervous system rather than the emotions in any conventional sense. Gone Girl is their second Fincher collaboration, and if the Social Network score was about the inhuman pace of digital capitalism, the Gone Girl score is about something more domestic and more insidious: the slow, patient decomposition of trust. The primary sonic palette of the Gone Girl score is built from keyboards and synthesizers processed to a quality that's neither warm nor cold, but something between them. A temperature that doesn't resolve, that keeps your body slightly uncertain about what it's feeling. There are melodic phases, but they are structured to resist the satisfaction of resolution. They begin in one emotional register and drift into another without completing, without landing, with the specific quality of a musical sentence that never reaches its period. This is deliberate. Reznor and Ross are scoring a film about incompletion, about a marriage that never resolved into whatever it was supposed to become, about identities that are always mid-performance, about a narrative that the audience wants to see conclude and which refuses to. The score's most distinctive quality is what happens in the spaces between its phrases. Reznor and Ross are composers who understand silence as a compositional element, who use what's not there as precisely as what is. In the lake house sequences particularly, the score breathes in long, unhurried measures with silences that arrive exactly where the emotional tension is highest and sit there uncomfortably long enough for you to feel their weight before the next phrase begins. It's a genuinely sophisticated musical strategy, and it's one that only works because the film has been built with the same understanding of silence's power in every other formal element. The opening theme, the main theme of Gone Girl, introduced in the opening frames over the creeping camera moved toward Amy's head, is a piece of musical architecture that rewards close attention across multiple viewings because of how it evolves throughout the film. In its first iteration, over the opening image, the theme has a quality that's almost lullaby adjacent, slow, cyclical, built on a simple melodic figure that repeats with incremental variations. It's the kind of music that could, in a different context, be genuinely tender. There's something in it of the intimate, private quality of music played in a house late at night when everyone else is asleep. But the instrumentation undermines the tenderness systematically. The keyboard tones are processed to carry a faint, persistent undertone of unease, the kind of sonic texture that your body registers before your conscious mind identifies it as wrong. By the film's second act, when the same thematic material reappears in the Ozark sequences, the theme has been stripped down. Less melodic content, more drone. The lullaby quality has given way to something that sounds like the electronic hum of a monitoring system, which is exactly right because the Ozark sequences are Amy monitoring her own plan, tracking its execution with the focused, unemotional attention of surveillance equipment. The theme's final appearance, over the closing image, returns to the opening's instrumentation, but with a crucial change. The slight warmth that was present in the opening version, however undermined by the undertone of unease, is gone. What remains is pure dread, pure cycle, pure repetition without the possibility of variance. The marriage as a closed loop. The music arriving exactly where it started, having traveled through everything the film contains, and finding that it's still the same song. That's the final argument, delivered in sound rather than image. Sugarstorm and the score's playful edge. One of the less discussed qualities of the Gone Girl score is its occasional deliberate playfulness. a quality that operates in tension with the dominant register of unease and produces exactly the kind of tonal instability that Fincher was after. The track, often referred to as Sugar Storm, used during Amy's Ozark sequences as she settles into her motel routine, has a lightness to it that's almost cheerful, and the almost is doing all the work. It skirts the edge of whimsy the way a very sharp knife skirts the edge of casual. It suggests a woman enjoying herself, the specific, private pleasure of a plan proceeding correctly, while maintaining the undertone that reminds you this enjoyment is predicated on something terrible. The music is doing what Amy's face is doing in these sequences, performing a register that's appropriate to the surface situation while carrying, just underneath, the information that the surface is a construction. This willingness to let the score be occasionally darkly funny, to find the absurdist humor in the situation rather than sustaining unrelenting grimness, is part of what makes the Gone Girl score more durable than most thriller scores of its era. Unrelenting grimness becomes monotonous. The score's tonal variety mirrors the film's, and both are the richer for it. Sound design. Beyond the score, the non-score sound design in Gone Girl is a collaborative achievement that deserves its own paragraph because Fincher's relationship to ambient sound is as precise as his relationship to every other formal element of his work. The sound design team, working under the supervision of Ren Klyce, another Fincher regular who has done sound work on virtually every Fincher film since 7N, builds a sonic world for Gone Girl that's characterized by its specific functional reality rather than its dramatic enhancement. The Missouri exterior scenes sound like Missouri, the drone of summer insects, the distant sound of highway traffic, the specific flatness of sound in open, unobstructed terrain. The police station sounds like a police station, fluorescent hum, the ambient murmur of an institutional space, the specific acoustic quality of rooms designed for function rather than comfort. This sonic realism functions the same way Cronenberg's documentary adjacent cinematography functions. It grounds the film in a reality that the thriller elements are then operating inside rather than creating a separate, heightened reality for the thriller to inhabit. The effect is subtle but cumulative. By the time the film's most dramatic moments arrive, the confrontations, the revelation, the return, the sound world around them is so thoroughly real, so specifically not the ambient music bed of a conventional thriller, that the dramatic moments carry the weight of real events rather than staged ones. The sound design's most interesting choice is what it does with the media apparatus. The television coverage, the press conference sound systems, the cable news monitors in the background of scenes. These sound sources are presented with the specific, slightly compressed, slightly processed quality of actual broadcast audio rather than clean studio sound. Ellen Abbott's voice on a television in the bar doesn't sound like a performance of television. It sounds like an actual television, with all the quality loss and acoustic displacement that implies. This choice, treating the media sound as technically degraded, processed, removed from the acoustic reality of the spaces the characters inhabit, encodes a subtle argument about the relationship between broadcast media and lived experience. The media sounds different from the world. It's translated, compressed, filtered, and yet the characters organize their understanding of reality around it. Editing. Kurt Baxter and the architecture of tempo. Kurt Baxter has edited every Fincher film since The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, and his work on Gone Girl received an Academy Award nomination for Best Film Editing, a recognition of what is genuinely one of the most technically sophisticated editorial achievements in the film's competition year. The fundamental challenge of editing Gone Girl is the management of its dual timeline structure. The film is constantly switching between Nick's present and Amy's past, and the editorial grammar of these switches, how long each scene runs before cutting, what the cut lands on, how the momentum of one timeline is preserved or transformed by the transition into the other, is doing as much structural work as anything in the screenplay. A clumsy editor kills this film. An adequate editor maintains it. Baxter turns the structure into a formal pleasure. The most consistent tool Baxter deploys is what might be called the emotional rhyme cut, a transition between the two timelines that lands on an image or a quality in the new timeline that resonates directly with what was just left behind in the previous one. A shot of Amy and Nick happy in the New York apartment, warm in amber, cuts to a shot of Nick alone in the Missouri house, the same spatial relationship to the frame but stripped of warmth and company. The emotional content of the first shot, the presence of intimacy, arrives in the second shot as absence, and the cut between them makes you feel that conversion rather than just understand it. This is editing as emotional argument, and Baxter executes it with remarkable consistency across a film that has dozens of such moments. The pacing across the film's two acts is also a significant editorial achievement. The first act, Nick's investigation, the investigation gathering steam, the public narrative forming, is cut with a tempo that feels, on first viewing, like the rhythm of a conventional thriller, scenes building on each other, momentum accumulating, each revelation recontextualizing what came before. It's only on second viewing that you notice how the first act's tempo has been engineered to match Amy's design rather than the investigation's genuine pace. The story is moving at the speed Amy built it to move at, and Baxter's editing respects and amplifies that design. The second act, after Amy's survival is revealed, as the film shifts from mystery to dramatic irony, slows, not to the point of languor, but to the pace of consequence rather than discovery. Things that happen in Act 2 take longer to happen in editorial terms than comparable events in Act 1. You sit with the lake house sequences. You sit with Nick's deliberations. Baxter allows the film to breathe at the pace that the dramatic irony requires. Slower, because when you know where things are going, speed becomes a way of avoiding the feeling, and this film insists on the feeling. The editing of Amy's sequences. Baxter's editorial approach to Amy's scenes, both in the diary flashbacks and in the Ozarks Lake house present tense sequences, differs subtly but meaningfully from his approach to Nick's scenes, and the difference encores the film's structural argument about whose story we're actually watching. Amy's diary scenes are cut with the quality of inevitability, scenes that feel like they're arriving where they were always going, building toward predetermined conclusions, each cut landing with the finality of a door closing. This is the editorial grammar of constructed narrative. Amy's diary has an author, and the editing of those scenes feels authored in a way that Nick's messier, less controlled present tense scenes don't. Nick's scenes are cut with slightly more roughness at the edges, not sloppiness, but the editorial quality of events that are happening to someone rather than being directed by them. His timeline is reactive. Amy's is composed. When the film transitions from the diary to the Ozarks reveal, when the amber certainty of Amy's constructed past gives way to the grey, functional reality of her present, the editorial tempo resets with a jolt. The Ozarks scenes are cut with a directness, an absence of flourish that's almost clinical. Events happen. Time passes. The editing doesn't enhance them. It simply records, in the stripped down way of surveillance footage rather than drama, a woman doing what she planned to do. The editorial register change is the film's formal announcement that you are now watching the real thing rather than the performance. The editing of the revelation, the midpoint reveal, following Amy into the motel and understanding that she's alive and planned, is one of the best edited sequences in Baxter's body of work, and it's worth examining precisely because of how it achieves its effect. The sequence doesn't announce itself. There's no musical swell, no dramatic camera move, no editorial punctuation that says, "This is important." Baxter cuts from Nick's investigation timeline into Amy's present with the same rhythm he's been using for diary transitions throughout the film, and it takes the audience a beat, sometimes two, to recognize that what they're watching is not a flashback. The calendar on the motel wall shows the current date. Amy is watching the press conference that we just watched. The room has the grey palette of Nick's timeline, not the amber of the diary. The moment of recognition, the audience's realization that Amy is alive, that this is present tense, that everything shifts, arrives differently for different viewers at different points in those few seconds. And Baxter has designed the sequence to allow for that individual landing rather than enforcing a single moment of collective revelation. The information is present from the first frame.